Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm Robin Moody. I just recently had a change in, I'm a public member here today, and I recently changed my role, and I'm executive director of the Oral Health Population Health Organization Dental 3 now. Thank you.
Welcome, Robin.
Bill Origer. I'm faculty on the Family Medicine Residency Program at Samaritan Corvallis.
Welcome, Bill. And we'll also turn it over to staff. If anybody recognizes on my team another committee member that joins, let me know and we'll address them after we go to the staff. Jennifer, we'll lead off with you.
Hi, Jennifer Bowen, Executive Support Specialist with the Oregon Health Authority.
Jennifer. This is Roger Sitchin. I'm the Program Manager for the Drug Use Research and Management Program, and me and my team provide clinical support to the OHA.
And I'm Trevor Douglas. I am the Pharmacy Programs and Policy Director for the Oregon Health Authority.
I am Dave Ingen, Clinical Pharmacist with the OSU Derm Group.
I'm Sarah Fletcher. I'm one of the P&T Clinical Co-Coordinators for the OSU Derm Group.
I'm Andrew Gibler. I'm the Clinical Pharmacy and Programs Manager for Oregon Health Authority.
I'm Kyle Hamilton. I'm the Pharmacy Drug Coordinator here at OHA.
Dean's not with us, so Megan, will turn to you.
Hi, I'm Megan Herring. I'm a clinical pharmacist with the College of Pharmacy.
Good afternoon. I'm Deanna Moretz. I'm a pharmacist with the Oregon State University College of Pharmacy.
Hello, and Amanda, there you go.
Hi, I'm Amanda Parrish. I am the coordinator for the Mental Health Clinical Advisory Group with OHA.
I'm Kathy Sedtena. I'm a clinical pharmacist with Oregon State University as well.
And hi, my name is Sarah Servid. I am one of the P&T clinical co-coordinators for OSU Derm Group.
Hi, I'm Lance Starkweather. I'm the Pharmacy Services Manager for Gainwell Technologies.
And Dee's not with us. I'm I'm Brandon Wells, the Pharmacy Program Analyst at Oregon Health Authority. I cover the fee-for-service program.
Welcome, everybody. As you can see, we have a strong team behind the scenes that helps make these meetings essentially, hopefully, seem seamless and provide good recommendations to the OHA. So with that on the agenda, I just wanted to remind the audience, we will be posting slides with some of our talking points as we go along. However, on our website, you can access a full packet of the P&T materials and written comments that have been submitted for our consideration and the OHA's as well as the committee. Those have been forwarded to the committee for review in advance of the meeting. So the approval of the agenda with the committee's blessing, I just wanted to let you know that, as you can see, we do have a very robust agenda and we have significant amount of public comment. So with your blessing, unless I hear any pushback, we may adjust the sequence of events towards the end of the agenda. We currently have Spravato and Evkeeza as the last two items. We would, if we have to cancel items, put Spravato as the last topic, Evkeeza is the penultimate topic, and then see where we're at with the pulmonary arterial hypertension and topical antipsychotics. I apologize to people that have signed up to provide public comment that if we are not able to get to that topic, we will put it on a December or February meeting and move that along. However, we will endeavor to get through the entire agenda today. So with that, we have conflict of interest declaration. Very important for the OHA that conflict of interest are declared not only by the P&T committee members when they register and as their continued appointment, for staff members, both from contractors like us and Gainwell, as well as the OHA, that those are disclosed and we fill out those forms annually. And this is an opportunity for the committee at this point to let us know if you have any new conflicts that need to be disclosed to the OHA. Hearing none, we have approval of the minutes. The minutes from the previous P&T meeting have been sent out to the committee for review in advance. We need to see if you have any edits to propose to the OHA, and if not, we need a motion to approve.
Move to approve.
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
Fantastic. And with that, we have a department update. I don't know if Andrew, you're providing that, or Trevor is on the call. Who's going to fight over this?
I am going to fight and win, at least today. The Trevor Douglas era, and thank you everybody for giving up your afternoon to this effort. I just appreciate each and every one of you. Understand that there are just so many things that can take up your time and have been taking up your time as we continue to battle the epidemic. So thank you. I just want to make sure that everybody is astutely aware of some staffing changes. I think this was shared last time, but I just want to share it again. Dana Harganani has moved to directly advise Patrick Allen as the agency's chief medical officer, and has moved directly into the director's office. And that leaves her position as the director of the Office of Delivery System Innovation to an interim director, Chris DeMars, and that is who I directly report to. And otherwise, all of the organizational structure remains the same. Unfortunately for Dee, Andrew, and Amanda, they all still report to me. So the other thing I just wanted to say is I need your help. I know I've already asked a lot of you to just by the mere fact of you giving up an afternoon, but we're really seeking assistance to try to find additional actively practicing physicians to fill spots on this committee for the upcoming year. And so to that extent, if there are colleagues that you feel are ready for this challenge, please do share that opportunity with them. If they wish to understand better what that means, by all means, let them have my phone number, email, whatever they might need, or reach out to Roger as well. We're all happy to take your inquiries and calls. With that, I understand you have a huge agenda. Don't want to take up any more of your time. If there's any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. But other than that, questions from the committee, that is, not the public. Public, just get in line and send me an email.
Hey, Trevor, it's Stacy.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, so are we just looking for physicians or providers in general?
At this point, we will still accept applications for any of the openings that we have, but in particular, we do have several pharmacist applicants, but we have very few, if any, physician applicants.
Okay, sounds good. I'll send out an email to our provider group. I just wanted to clarify if I needed to make it specific.
Yes. Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Trevor. Any other questions for Trevor? All right, with that, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Those have been posted. Again, this is an opportunity to add agents to our oncology and orphan drug policies. Also to do scans on different literature classes. When we don't find any compelling evidence that requires a discussion, we're just going to be looking at pricing executive session we had in the consent agenda. So unless the committee asks that this be moved to the open session, we need a move to approve.
Move to approve.
Seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? All right, the consent agenda is approved.
All right, and we're going to be moving on. Again, robust agenda. We have a lot of public comment. I just want to call out, if anybody on the call has expressed an interest to provide public comment and submitted that through the website, as we request you do, and did not receive confirmation from me that that was received with directions about how to sign up, please make sure you instant message or reach out to Sarah Fletcher. She will help navigate getting that conflict of interest declaration and getting you in the queue to provide public comment. Again, only those who wish to provide public comment that did not receive confirmation that was received. And the other request is outside parties have asked P&T committee members, when you ask questions or speak up to engage in the dialogue, if you could identify yourself, that would help the public and us understand who is speaking. Sometimes it's hard to track who is making a comment, but if you just preface that with your name, that would be much appreciated. So with that, again, referring to the package, the P&T pack that's put on our website, we'll be starting on page 75, and we're going to turn it over to Deanna Moretz. Deanna, all you.
All right, thank you, Roger. And you can see by this slide, it's targeted immune modulators. I think the agenda states biologics for autoimmune disorders. So we're trying to move towards calling this entire class targeted immune modulators instead of biologics. So next slide, please. So this drug class update, we're reviewing any new comparative evidence that was published since our last discussion, which was November of last year. Just as a reminder, there are a lot of rare diseases that the targeted immune modulators are used for, but we're just going to focus on these 6 diseases during the discussion today. Next slide, please. Just wanted to remind you what drugs we're talking about. This particular table is on page 80 of the packet. If you need to see it a little bit more clearly, the top 3/4 of this chart are what we consider the biologic disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, or DMARDs. And those are large complex proteins that must be administered parenterally. So you can see they're either administered by IV infusion or sub-Q injection. And it encompasses the TNF inhibitors, the interleukin antagonists, and then a couple unique mechanisms like the integrin receptor and some lymphocyte inhibitors there towards the bottom of that particular part of the chart. And then the very bottom are the targeted synthetic DMARDs. I just wanted to orient you to the different types of DMARDs we'll be talking about. So these are oral drugs. And of note that we have a new MS drug that has joined this group of drugs. So ozanimod recently received approval to treat ulcerative colitis. So that will impact our PA criteria when we talk about that later. The biggest difference is these drugs can be given orally because they're smaller molecules. Next slide, please. So there were 6 systematic reviews that have been published since our last review. And we'll go through these one by one, hopefully fairly efficiently in the interest of time. Most of these systematic reviews were used as the supporting evidence for clinical guidance, clinical guideline update. So the first one we have to discuss is the American Gastroenterological Association, which came out with some guidance for management of ulcerative colitis. I've only put the moderate quality evidence on this slide. The additional low quality evidence is discussed in your packet. So the AGA decided after reviewing the evidence that for inducing emission in ulcerative colitis, that infliximab and vodolizumab are probably superior to adalimumab. And then they also found some evidence that showed combination therapy with infliximab and a conventional synthetic DMARD, that's the 3rd class of DMARDs, which is typically azathioprine or methotrexate. That's probably superior to just monotherapy. And we had limited direct head-to-head assessment for comparative safety. So next slide, please. So there was a Cochrane review that was also published just this year. This Cochrane review was mostly a network meta-analysis. And the reason for that was because there was very limited direct head-to-head comparisons. So I just summarized the 3 trials that had some direct head-to-head comparative evidence in the management of plaque psoriasis that showed that these drugs were effective in resulting in PASI 90, which means clear or almost clear skin at 52 weeks. Interestingly enough, risankizumab and guselkumab, those are the, well, guselkumab is a IL-17. The other 2 drugs are IL-23 inhibitors. Interesting that they used ustekinumab as the active comparator because that's typically used for ulcerative colitis, but it does have approval for plaque psoriasis. And then adalimumab, we will see that that is a lot of times used as the active comparator for a lot of these trials. It's been on the market the longest, and it is a TNF inhibitor. So they showed good evidence for PASI 90, and similar effects we're seeing with PASI 75. Once again, there wasn't a deep dive because there was not a lot of evidence about differences in specific adverse effects. Next slide, please. So the European League Against Rheumatism, they published the next 3 systematic reviews that we will be talking about. So the first one is the systematic review about management of psoriatic arthritis. And all of these trials that they evaluated were mostly placebo-controlled. There were no head-to-head comparisons that were identified. Most of these trials were in patients that had not responded to methotrexate. So they found that there was good evidence for guselkumab, secukinumab, izokizumab, and brodalumab, as well as tofacitinib in alleviating symptoms associated with psoriatic arthritis. The PDE4 inhibitor, apremilast, also had good evidence when compared to placebo in alleviating symptoms, but they did not have any evidence about the impact on radiographic outcomes. I wanted to point out some safety concerns that were identified with this. They didn't see any new signals for the TNF inhibitors, but with izokizumab compared to placebo, more injection site reactions were observed, as well as an increased number of candida infections. And then with tofacitinib, we saw an increased rate of herpes zoster infections compared to placebo. Next slide, please. So EULAR did 2 separate systematic reviews when they were looking at RA. One systematic review just focused on efficacy, and then the second one focused on safety. So when we look at head-to-head comparisons, once again, those were relatively sparse. There was one comparison that looked at seraluumab compared to adalimumab, and it showed that there was good effectiveness compared to adalimumab in rheumatoid arthritis. The 3 JAK inhibitors also, when they were compared to adalimumab, had good results when they were combined with methotrexate on the clinical and functional endpoints for RA. If you're interested in looking at those endpoints, in the interest of time, those are all summarized in Appendix 4 on page 111. All of the endpoints for these different diseases are summarized there. So these trials that are illustrated on this slide were basically the trials that led to the approval, the FDA approval of these drugs. Next slide, please. So if you've been reading the medical press lately, you may have seen that the JAK inhibitors have been getting a lot of attention because there's concern that there's an increased risk of venothromboembolic events with the JAK inhibitors. This particular systematic review that was published in 2019, the authors did not find an increased risk of VTE with tofacitinib. And also they didn't see an increase with abatacept either. They did see, similar to the other study that we looked at, the other systematic review, that there was an increased risk of herpes zoster with tofacitinib when it was compared to abatacept. And then tocilizumab, it has an increased risk of lower intestinal perforation. So just a safety alert to keep our eye on with that particular drug. Next slide, please. There was another meta-analysis that just focused on looking at venous thromboembolic risk with the JAK inhibitors, tofacitinib, abemaciclib, and baricitinib, which are all used, they're effective for treating RA. Tofacitinib also has approval for psoriatic arthritis and ulcerative colitis. This particular systematic review did not find that there was a significant increased risk of VTE or DVT. There was an increased risk of PE if you look at the confidence interval. But what people thought was interesting with this particular systematic review is they excluded any data from the long-term open label extension trials, which is where we see a lot of the safety alerts that arise. So let's contrast that with the next slide, which was the FDA drug safety communication that was recently issued. So last month, the FDA strengthened the warning they had regarding the risk of serious cardiovascular related events, cancer, thrombosis, and death associated with the JAK inhibitors. And that was based on a large randomized open label post-marketing safety clinical trial, which the FDA had asked the manufacturer of tofacitinib to conduct. And that looked at 2 doses of tofacitinib, the 5 milligram and the 10 milligram doses. The 5 milligram dose is what's FDA approved for rheumatoid arthritis. This data did show that there was a dose-dependent increased risk of major cardiovascular events, all-cause mortality, and thrombosis with both doses of tofacitinib. The FDA considers this a class effect. And so even though we don't have data on baricitinib or abemaciclib, the FDA has issued the safety communication to say that all JAK inhibitors, most of the patients that were at risk for these cardiovascular events already had one cardiovascular risk, and a lot of them were older. So we will be seeing changes to the black box warnings for all 3 of these drugs in the near future. Next slide, please. Moving into the guidelines, we have 5 high quality guidelines that were published since the last update. So the first is the American Gastroenterologic Association. And most of those recommendations were conditional because, as I pointed out earlier, the quality of evidence was rather low. They did say that there are a handful of drugs that are effective in managing ulcerative colitis, including infliximab, adalimumab, golimumab, vedolizumab, tofacitinib, or ustekinumab. Those are effective compared to no treatment. This was a strong recommendation based on moderate quality of evidence. I just want to point out those drugs are in order by the year they were approved by the FDA, not in order of efficacy. Next slide. So the EULAR guidance for management of psoriatic arthritis, it's basically, if you look at these 3 bullets, they're saying to start with a conventional synthetic DMARD, such as methotrexate. And if the patient doesn't do well with that, or their symptoms are not alleviated, to move to a biologic DMARD. And if there's relevant skin involvement, using an IL-17 inhibitor or an IL-12-23 inhibitor might be preferred. Just as a reminder, the IL-17 inhibitors we're talking about are izokizumab or Taltz and secukinumab or Cosentyx. And then the IL-12-23 inhibitor that we have is ustekinumab. So if patients don't respond to methotrexate and a biologic, then it's reasonable to move to a JAK inhibitor. And the only JAK inhibitor that's approved for psoriatic arthritis right now is tofacitinib. If the patient doesn't do well with a JAK inhibitor, then it might be reasonable to progress to the PDE4 inhibitor, apremilast. So that was the guidance that EULAR came up with for psoriatic arthritis. When we talk about RA, if we can go to the next slide, basically same thing. The EULAR is saying if we don't see improvement in RA with using methotrexate to progress to a biologic DMARD or a targeted synthetic DMARD, and any therapy for treating rheumatoid arthritis should be combined with methotrexate to have the best efficacy. Next slide, please. We have two pieces of guidance that the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence issued. So the first has to do with upadacitinib and RA. And basically they're just saying if a patient has failed methotrexate, rituximab, or a biologic DMARD, and they still have severe disease as measured by a DAS28 score greater than 5.1, then upadacitinib could be implemented in combination with methotrexate. The second bullet says that monotherapy is appropriate if the patient cannot take methotrexate because it's contraindicated or if it's not tolerant. And then NICE goes on to say that the disease response should be evaluated at 6 months after starting therapy to ensure there's an appropriate response. And this mirrors the PA criteria that we have. We usually approve these drugs for 6 months so we can evaluate if patients are responding to therapy. Next slide, please. Again, it's NICE guidance, and this is guidance that came out for using ustekinumab for ulcerative colitis. And if a TNF inhibitor has failed, then using this IL-12/23 inhibitor is recommended. All right, next slide, please. So when you reviewed this class update, you may have noticed that there were quite a few expanded indications for the targeted immune modulators in the last year. Most of the expanded indications were to expand to use in pediatric patients. You can see quite a few of these are lowering the age at which the drug is approved. We do have ozanimod, as I mentioned earlier, that's now approved for treatment of adults with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. And then we had some expanded indications for rare diseases. So anakinra is now approved for deficiency of the IL-1 receptor. And then tocilizumab is approved for systemic sclerosis that's associated with interstitial lung disease. So let's talk about our changes to the PA criteria. Those are on page 116 of the packet. I just highlighted the changes here because the PA criteria, if you remember, it's fairly complex. So the biggest thing I wanted to point out is we're moving to change the title to be targeted immune modulators instead of biologics. So table 1, which is what we've been using for several years to keep track of all the approved indications and the ages, it was updated to reflect all the expanded indications. Gainwell was very astute, and they pointed out that we should modify question 5. TB screening is not required for apremilast. It is a PDE4 inhibitor. It doesn't work on the lymphocytes or TNF like the other drugs do. So we revised question number 5 to reflect that. And then question 6, initially we had all the rare diseases listed in question 6. And Sarah suggested we just simplify it with a reference to table 1 for the FDA approved indications, which made a lot of sense to simplify that particular question. Okay, next slide, please. So the changes to our oral MS criteria, we just added a couple of questions to the MS drugs to reflect the fact that ozanimod is now approved to treat moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. So question 2 asks if that's the indication. And then question 3 assesses if they've tried and failed conventional therapy as well as brand name adalimumab Humira. And then question 6, we added a question about, is this a gastroenterologist that's prescribing this? And then table 1 was revised to include the UC diagnosis as an FDA-approved indication for ozanimod. So just to summarize the recommendations on our next slide. So there's no changes to the PDL at this point. We're going to rename this class to be the targeted immune modulators. We're going to modify the PA criteria, both for the targeted immune modulators as well as the MS agents, like I just described. And then we'll review the costs in executive session. So with that, I would open it up to any questions from the P&T committee.
Great job, Deanna. Thank you. Questions for Deanna? If not, we'll move on to public comment.
I just want to say, oh, sorry, of course, my dog started barking as soon as I unmuted. I think we all need to tip our caps to Deanna for all of those pronunciations. I'm still just amazed.
Well, I won't say if I pronounce them correctly.
Well, shush. Yeah, just you pronounce them correctly.
The manufacturers can correct me if I did not pronounce them correctly.
That was an awesome job.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate that.
All right, with that, any other questions for Deanna? All right, we have 2 people that have signed up to provide public comment. If you're not Margaret Oman, or we have Carrie Johnson, I'll be calling upon you. Please instant message Sarah Fletcher, and we'll make sure and recognize you. But with that, Maggie, do you have the opportunity to unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now, Roger?
Yep, can hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic, thanks so much. My name is Dr. Margaret Ullman from Medical Affairs at AbbVie, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As you know, AbbVie now has 3 targeted immunomodulating medications available. I'd like to briefly review Skyrizi, Rinvoq, and Humira and answer any questions you might have. Please see the full prescribing information for all 3 products at rxabbvie.com for comprehensive safety and efficacy data. Skyrizi, risankizumab, is an IL-23 inhibitor indicated for the treatment of moderate to severe plaque psoriasis in adults and is given as a subcutaneous injection at week 0, 4, and every 12 weeks, which means 4 doses per year for maintenance treatment. In the 4 phase 3 clinical trials, it met all primary and ranked secondary endpoints. Skyrizi showed superior efficacy to Stelara in both PASI 90 and PASI 100 responses at 16 and 52 weeks. After 2 doses, 75% of patients had at least a 90% improvement in their PASI score, increasing to 83% of patients after 1 year of treatment. Skyrizi also showed a statistically significant difference versus Humira in PASI 90 at week 16 and after a switch from Humira intermediate responders. The incidence of adverse reactions in the integrated analysis was similar for Skyrizi, Humira, and Stelara in both the long and short term. There were no unexpected safety findings, and there are no contraindications to treatment. Rinvoq, upadacitinib, is an oral JAK inhibitor indicated for the treatment of adults with moderately to severely active rheumatoid arthritis, given as an oral 15 milligram tablet once daily. In the phase 3 clinical program, Rinvoq met all primary and ranked secondary endpoints in all 5 clinical trials, and significantly more patients achieved DAS28 remission and low disease activity versus controls in each of the trials. Rinvoq is the only approved JAK inhibitor to demonstrate inhibition of joint damage in its approved population of methotrexate inadequate responders. It is also the only targeted immunomodulator to show clinically superior to Humira plus methotrexate. The most common adverse reactions in the upadacitinib trials were upper respiratory tract infection, nausea, cough, and fever. As you recall, Humira has 10 currently approved indications. With long-standing safety data, 71 global clinical trials, 18 years of on-market experience, and over 1 million patients exposed, Humira has a well-defined published benefit to risk database. In summary, I recommend that the committee maintain preferred status for Humira on the PDL and add Skyrizi and Rinvoq as available treatments for Medicaid patients. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions for Maggie? Dr. Oman, I apologize. All right, thank you. With that, we also have a testimony signed up for Carrie Johnson with Amgen. Carrie, are you
can you hear me okay?
Yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
You bet.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Carrie Johnson, and I'm a pharmacist with Amgen Medical Affairs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of Otezla, or Apremilast. I want to give a few reminders and then some considerations for the product. Otezla is an orally administered small molecule that works intracellularly to inhibit phosphodiesterase 4, which results in a decrease in pro-inflammatory mediators and an increase in anti-inflammatory mediators, so a distinct mechanism of action. Otezla does not have a black box warning, nor does it have any warnings or precautions related to infection or malignancy. No laboratory monitoring or pre-medication screening is required per label. Otezla was first approved in 2014 and is indicated for the treatment of adult patients with active psoriatic arthritis and adult patients with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis who are candidates for phototherapy or systemic therapy. Importantly, Otezla is the only FDA-approved product for the treatment of adult patients with oral ulcers associated with Behçet's disease. Most commonly reported adverse events for Otezla include diarrhea, nausea, headache, and upper respiratory tract infection. Please see the Otezla full prescribing information for further details. A few considerations. In July 2019, Otezla became the first FDA-approved therapy for oral ulcers associated with Behçet's disease based on the RELIEF study. RELIEF was a 12-week multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 trial in adult patients with Behçet's disease with active oral ulcers. Otezla demonstrated significant improvement versus placebo in the number and pain of oral ulcers associated with Behçet's disease. Most commonly reported adverse events included diarrhea, nausea, headache, and upper respiratory tract infection. A second consideration, in April 2020, data from the STYLE study, it was a phase 3 study in scalp psoriasis, was added to the label. Otezla 30 milligrams twice daily demonstrated significantly greater improvement in moderate to severe scalp psoriasis, scalp and whole body itch compared to placebo at week 16, and improvements were maintained in patients continuing Otezla out to 32 weeks. Most common adverse events were diarrhea and nausea. Both STYLE and RELIEF are fully published phase 3 trials. Also, long-term 5-year safety and efficacy data from registrational psoriatic arthritis trials are fully published. Patients who continued Otezla treatment for 5 years maintained improvement in signs and symptoms of psoriatic arthritis with no new safety signals observed. Most commonly reported adverse events, again, were diarrhea, nausea, headache, upper respiratory tract infection, and nasopharyngitis. 2 recent guidelines distinguish Otezla from biologics and include the 2020 Joint American Academy of Dermatology guidelines and the 2018 Joint American College of Rheumatology and NPF guidelines. In summary, Otezla, please consider adding Otezla to the PDL. Otezla represents an oral option for adult patients with moderate to severe psoriasis, active psoriatic arthritis, or patients with oral ulcers associated with Behçet's disease. Otezla has no black box warning or label requirement for monitoring or pre-medication screening. And fully published phase 3 data are available in scalp psoriasis now, Behçet's disease, and our 5-year long-term data. Thank you for your time, and I'll address any questions.
Well, you had 8 seconds left. You could have
I know.
pages of the dictionary.
I've never heard someone talk as fast as you.
I tried to make the points clear, but I hope you got the idea. Yeah.
You did a great job.
My 8 seconds. Thank you, Roger. I appreciate the time to present. Thank you.
No, appreciate it. Questions? Questions for Carrie? Really? That's a lot of information for you not to have any questions. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So with that, we want
Thank
to
you.
refer back to the recommendations in front of the committee. Again, pretty robust class. We're not making any recommendations for changes to PDL based upon the clinical evidence, but we want to change the name of the class to the targeted immune modulators. I'm not going to even go into any of the drugs. That's left to Deanna to take control of those amazing names. But we do want to modify the PA criteria to reflect the expanded ages and indications for the different agents. We're also going to modify the PA criteria for the MS agents for the expanded indication for ozanimod. And then we're going to look at these in executive session. But for the first 4 bullets that are in front of you, any questions for Deanna? And if not, we need a recommendation to approve.
I motion to approve.
Second, or
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you all.
Great job. We're going to move on to the CGRP inhibitor class update. Refer you to page 132 in the packet posted to our website, and turn it over to Kathy Centena.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, so the purpose of this update is to look at the CGRP inhibitors and the evidence since the last review, which was done in August 2020, as well as to look at the new indication for rimagepant and then adjust policy if needed. As a reminder, we have 3 CGRP inhibitors that are used for migraine prevention: eptinezumab, erenumab, and frumenezumab. And then galcanezumab is approved for migraine prevention as well as cluster headache treatment. And then we have 2 agents used for acute migraine treatment, rimagepant and ubrogepant. And then we'll also talk about that additional preventative treatment indication for rimagepant here in a moment. Just to review policy for these treatments, frumenezumab and galcanezumab are preferred products on the PDL and are subject to clinical PA criteria. And then just kind of as an FYI, there was a new oral CGRP inhibitor released for migraine prevention that was approved in September, atogepant or Quilipta, which did not meet the timeline for inclusion into this review, but we'll be discussing it the next time the class is looked at. So on the next slide, we see that there was one systematic review that was identified, and this was done by ARC. It looked at the acute treatment for episodic migraine. So the 2 agents I just referenced, rimagepant, ubrogepant, were studied. The main outcomes they looked at were pain freedom at 2 hours, as well as pain freedom at 1 day, and this was compared to placebo. Both these treatments were found to be superior to placebo based on moderate to high quality evidence. There was a high risk of bias identified in the rimagepant trials by the authors as well. You can see there, though, there's no significant differences in adverse event rates between the CGRP inhibitors and placebo. Going to the next slide, we see that there was one high quality guideline identified, and this was a NICE guideline that looked at headache management for those individuals 12 years of age and older. Unfortunately, there were no specific recommendations for the CGRP inhibitors. However, it did just review general guidance, which is consistent, which was what's been previously reported. So for acute treatment, the use of NSAIDs, acetaminophen, or triptans. For prophylactic migraine treatment, things such as topiramate or propranolol, as well as amitriptyline in those that are where it's appropriate. And then lastly, for cluster headache treatment, the use of oxygen and triptans for acute treatment, and then verapamil can be considered for prophylactic therapy. So to go into the next slide to talk about the new indication. So it is for rimagepant, brand name Nurtec ODT. This was approved in May of 2021 for preventative treatment of episodic migraine in adult patients. This was a 12-week study in which rimagepant was given every other day orally compared to placebo. In adults that had at least 1 year history of migraine or chronic migraine, which only represented about 20% of the population, those with chronic migraine. The primary outcome was the change in mean number of migraine days per month, and rimagepant was shown to benefit patients with a reduction of about 1 less migraine per month compared to placebo. Moving on to the next slide, we do have one new safety warning, and that's for erenumab. The labeling has been updated to include the warning of new onset or worsening of pre-existing hypertension with the use of erenumab. So the recommendation for this class is no changes to the PDL are warranted based on the evidence identified and to evaluate costs in executive session. I do want to go over the PI criteria just briefly. It's mostly for clarification of a couple steps. So on this slide, table 1, we just added that new indication for Magipant of the preventative treatment of episodic migraine. On the next slide, I'm just going to highlight the clarifications because they're pretty brief, but of course, if there's questions or if we want to go over it in detail, we can certainly do so. You can see there, number 7, just adding the word abortive there for acute migraine treatment, just to make it a little bit more clear to the reader. On the next slide, number 9, again, just calling out that we're talking about prophylactic migraine therapy, again, to orient the PA help desk and make it a little bit easier to follow the criteria. And then the same thing in number 12 there that we call out that this is, we're talking about acute migraine treatment or abortive therapy. And then lastly, in number 15 there, we're talking about cluster headache and just updated the preventative treatment recommendations for cluster headache treatment. They're removing a couple agents. And then the renewal criteria on the next slide, again, in number 4, you can see highlighted just putting in there proving the therapy for 6 months to make that consistent with the other treatments. And lastly, in number 7, for renewal of cluster headache treatment, just that the patients had a positive response indicated by a reduction in the number of cluster headaches per month. So again, the recommendations for this class are just to no changes to the PDL based on the evidence and to look at the costs in executive session. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Question
Hi,
for Kathy.
I do. This is Kathy. A couple questions. The first one, it says that requires PA, and I'm not going to even try to say the names of the drugs, but a couple of them already are on the PDL. So I always get confused when it's on the PDL as yes, but then we're requiring a PA.
Right, they do still have to go through the clinical criteria, even if they are preferred agents.
Okay. And then my second question is, do we want to put like a safety measure in there for the Aimovig for pre-existing hypertension?
We can certainly do so. Yeah, we could add that. We could look at calling that out. When we talk about preventative therapies, if it's specifically for Erendumab. The one thing I need to go back and check, and off the top of my head, I'm not sure, some of them might have a safety warning. This one's just the one that's been updated in the last. So it potentially would apply to more than one, but we could certainly add that in there for all of those in which it applies to. Because the CGRP is a cardioprotective enzyme, and so that's why it's not necessarily surprising. So when we inhibit that, but yeah, we can definitely add that for all, and just make sure that that has been looked at or discussed with the patient rather.
Nice question, Kathy. We can look at that a little bit more and see if that can be called out. We also may have somebody that addresses that with our public comment. Before I move to the public comment, just want to make sure, any follow-ups, Kathy Zerung, or any other questions from the committee?
I am good with my answers. Go ahead.
One quick question for Kathy Santana. So the new data about the pre-existing hypertension, it's not a reason not to necessarily use these agents though, right? So we just want to make sure that someone's checking their blood pressure regularly, right? It's not like a contraindication.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. And again, I can look into that further in more detail, but yeah, and again, it's not that surprising as well, but yeah, it is right that at this point, it's just a warning. So.
Kathy, if you want to take a look at that, we do have some public comment. Again, as a reminder, I had Doctors Shear, Ullman, and Johnson sign up in advance to provide public comment. If you wish to provide public comment and signed up but didn't get a response from me, please message Sarah Fletcher. You can do that through this application. Just let her know that you are interested. But if not, we just have those three. And with that, Dr. Scheer, are you able to unmute yourself again? I guess for the first time, you have another one later in the agenda.
Roger, I see another question from the P&T committee.
Please.
Hi, this is Kat Livingston with HealthShare. I was just looking at the renewal criteria, and I'm wondering if this group has previously considered when it says demonstrated by a reduction in migraine headache frequency and or intensity from baseline, about the utility of putting clinically significant in there.
We could, yes, I mean, we definitely we could add that. I know we kind of gone back and forth with the exact requirements, but we could definitely add that, add the words clinically significant to it. Because you were referring to number 4, is that correct? Reduction in clinically significant migraine headache frequency.
It's in 5 and 7 as well, I think.
Okay.
I struggle with some of these studies, you know, some of the times they're like, it decreases it by 0.2 of a day. And you're like, oh, I don't know.
Well, you're exactly right. And if you look at all of these, I mean, that's a great point. They do reduce them about 1 to 2 episodes compared to placebo, preventative ones at least per month. So yeah, you're right. It is a lot of times it's can be a small change. So that's a great point.
I appreciate the cap, but then do we need to define clinically significant?
Would defer to literature standards on that, which I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, the differentiation in language kind of seems to mean something to us, right? To go from a 0.2 to 2 or 3 or a real number. But if we had that kind of language, what does it mean?
You know, it's interesting because for me, this would apply to all the criteria, you know, so it's going to be different for migraines versus, you know, maybe cluster headaches versus, I don't know, eye pain, or, you know, like it's going to be different depending on the condition. But I just wonder if there's an opportunity to think about an overall standard with whatever improvement we're looking for would be clinically significant, kind of as defined by the standard criteria of that particular condition and well accepted.
I totally appreciate the comments, right? I think it helps refine and hone our criteria, not only this, but all criteria. So you're saying more broadly, we need to kind of define that. It certainly seems to be a takeaway for my team to look at the evidence and how that's defined and then tee it up for the committee to say yay or nay, that is clinically significant. But I think we need to define it in this case and others. So let's ruminate on that. We do have some public comment, but that's a great comment, Kat. I appreciate it. The more we can hone these to have something that's measurable, it really helps our Gainable Technologies States PA unit, right? And if they can have something measurable to review, that's always valuable. So it's a great question. Really appreciate it. Let's revisit that in a moment. So with that, we do have 3 people that have signed up for public comment. First is Jennifer Scheer. Dr. Scheer, do you have the ability to unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Hear you loud and clear.
Great, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Scheer. I am on the Value, Evidence, and Outcomes team with Teva Pharmaceuticals Field Medical Affairs. And today I'm here to provide information about AJOVY, fremanezumab injection. AJOVY is indicated for the preventive treatment of migraine in adult patients, and AJOVY may be administered by healthcare professionals, patients, and or caregivers subcutaneously as once monthly 225 milligram or quarterly 675 milligram dosing, given as 3 225 milligram injections. The AJOVY auto-injector became available April of last year. AJOVY is the only long-acting self-administered subcutaneous anti-CGRP with the option of monthly or quarterly dosing, allowing it to be dosed as few as 4 times per year, either with the auto-injector or the pre-filled syringe. AJOVY Quarterly is now available in a triple pack. And today I'd like to provide an update on real-world evidence for AJOVY, evaluating the real-world experience with AJOVY, comparing before and after AJOVY initiation. The following statistically significant changes were observed. First, in the analysis of pharmacy claims, the total annual claims for acute medications, specifically opioids and triptans, as well as the proportions of patients filling claims for these medications decreased. Two, in analysis of linked EMR and claims records, migraine pain intensity decreased significantly, and the majority of patients reported improvements in headache frequency or symptoms. Three, adherence was also significantly higher for patients receiving quarterly with an NPR of 84% versus monthly AJOVY with an NPR of 79% for 6 months. Most patients who discontinued AJOVY had permanently discontinued all preventive migraine therapy. And real-world pre-post retrospective studies referenced here suggest association and not causality. And lastly, across 24 clinical studies in the AJOVY clinical development program, over 4,000 patients with migraine have been exposed to AJOVY. No additional safety signals were seen across the exposed population. And pooled data from 3 phase 3 trials indicate treatment with AJOVY over 12 weeks has a cardiovascular safety profile similar to placebo, and in patients with a cardiovascular medical history and with cardiovascular risk factors, no safety signals were detected. Lastly, 1.08% of phase 3 clinical trial participants have reported constipation. And this concludes my comment today. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Dr. Scheer? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Ullman, are you able to unmute yourself again?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me, Roger?
Yes, can hear you loud and clear. And the floor is yours again.
Hi, I'm Dr. Margaret Ullman with Medical Affairs at AbbVie. AbbVie is the only pharmaceutical company to offer 3 treatments across the full spectrum of migraine to help patients living with this debilitating disease. The first treatment option is Botox, the most well-studied toxin and the only one approved for chronic migraine prevention. Today, I will focus my comments on the second medication, ubrelvy, an oral CGR receptor antagonist approved for the acute treatment of migraine. However, I'd also like to let you know that the FDA has just approved the 3rd drug in this portfolio, atogepant or Qulipta, an oral CGR receptor antagonist developed specifically for preventing episodic migraine. Although triptans continue to be the standard of care for the acute treatment of migraine attacks, there are patients with vasospastic and ischemic cardiovascular conditions who should not be prescribed triptans. Additionally, there are robust data confirming that over 50% of patients prescribed oral triptans discontinue therapy primarily due to insufficient response or side effects. Ubrelvy has 5 different ways it differentiated itself from the newer agents as well as triptans. First, Ubrelvy has been proven to be safe and effective with flexible doses of 50 and 100 milligrams and a tolerability profile similar to that of placebo in a 52-week long-term safety study where patients were able to treat up to 8 migraines per month with up to 2 doses per attack. Ubrelvy can be used in patients with cardiovascular disease. It has only one contraindication related to concomitant use with strong CYP3A4 inhibitors and no warnings or precautions. The most common adverse events are nausea and somnolence at 4% or less. Second, Ubrelvy does not have any warnings or precautions related to medication use, overuse headache. Third, the phase 3 clinical studies of Ubrelvy should be representative of your migraine population since they included patients with cardiovascular disease, comorbid depression, and those who had previously failed triptans. Fourth, Ubrelvy is only being studied for the acute treatment of migraine. This means that Ubrelvy should translate to a more predictable utilization pattern in your population. Lastly, Ubrelvy is the only migraine drug with second dose efficacy. It has demonstrated pain freedom rates up to 55% in patients who chose to take an optimal second dose. This has only been a short review. For complete safety and efficacy information, please refer to rxabbvie.com. I want to close by respectfully asking Ubrelvy be considered as a preferred agent in this category for patients with acute migraine. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Dr. Ullman? All right, and finally we have Dr. Johnson from Amgen. Are you able to unmute yourself once again?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hear you loud and clear, and the floor is yours once again.
Okay, thanks a lot. Again, Carrie Johnson, pharmacist with Amgen Medical Affairs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of Aimovig or Renyumab. Aimovig is a fully human monoclonal antibody to the calcitonin gene-related peptide, CGRP receptor, and is indicated for the preventive treatment of migraine in adults. It was approved in 2018 and can be self-administered using the SureClick auto-injector. It also comes in 2 dosing options. Of the injectable CGRP products, Aimovig is the only one that specifically targets the CGRP receptor. Aimovig has an established safety and tolerability profile. The most common adverse events in clinical studies included injection site reactions and constipation. So warnings and precautions have been updated. They include hypersensitivity reactions, constipation with serious complications. That was label updated in October 2019, and new onset or worsening of pre-existing hypertension. The label was updated in April of 2020. Both updates were a result of post-marketing surveillance. Of note, no evidence of increased risk of hypertension for Aimovig versus placebo was observed in clinical trials. The majority of patients had pre-existing hypertension or risk factors for hypertension. Please see the full Aimovig prescribing information for further details. Please consider adding Aimovig to the PDL to allow providers greater choice in this category, and for the following reasons. 1, migraine pathophysiology is multifactorial and complex. Migraine is a very heterogeneous disorder, and not all migraine patients respond to or tolerate these agents equally, as evidenced by utilization. 2, Aimovig is unique in that it specifically targets the CGRP receptor, not the ligand, and requires no loading dose or titration. While the recommended monthly dose is 70 milligrams, the 140 milligram dose provides dosing flexibility that some patients do benefit from. 3, Aimovig is the only injectable preventive with 5 years of published safety and efficacy data. Patients receiving Aimovig out to 5 years experience sustained reductions of 62% from baseline in the number of monthly migraine days, as well as significant reductions in the use of acute migraine-specific medications, such as triptans, ergots, and opiates. Aimovig was generally well tolerated. No increase in adverse events over time was seen, and no new safety signals were observed. There were no meaningful changes in blood pressure or heart rate through the end of the study. 4th, Aimovig is the first and currently only CGRP preventive to demonstrate superior tolerability and efficacy against topiramate in a randomized, double-blind, head-to-head study in patients with episodic and chronic migraine, the Hermes study. A greater proportion of patients receiving Aimovig achieved at least a 50% reduction in their monthly migraine days, with less discontinuations over the course of the 24-week treatment phase. Migraine is a highly debilitating disease that has significant impact on people's lives. Aimovig has a unique mechanism of action, published 5-year data, and has shown superiority to topiramate in a head-to-head trial. Please consider adding Aimovig to the PDL to allow providers greater choice in this category. Thank you for your time. Okay.
Thanks, Carrie. You were too fast. I didn't have time to find my mute button. So any questions? No, you did a great job. Any questions for Dr. Johnson? All right, reminding the committee of the recommendations. No changes to the PDL based on the evidence, but we are going to review this in executive session. Again, any questions for Kathy Centena? Or Kathy, do you have any additional information to throw out there?
Well, sure. So Imatinib is the only one with the cardiovascular warning at this point. So we could add that in number 10 if the committee would like to in the PA criteria or after number 10. I'm just asking if the patient has hypertension or risk factors. We could then to deny it if they feel strongly about that recommendation.
I would like it there. This is Kathy Zeri.
This is Karen, and I'm supportive of that addition as well.
Ruth, or you?
All right, so I'm hearing move to approve the PA criteria as proposed and amended and review an executive session. And do we have to revisit clinically significant to define that in some way, or is that something for staff to take away?
I think since it potentially is a larger discussion than just this, I would say it's something for staff to take away.
So I'm hearing in this case and future cases, if possible, try to define clinically significant to be a little more descriptive for the change, and then something to chew on. But otherwise, PA criteria as proposed and amended.
I would support that too. This is Robin.
I think we have a motion on the table. Is that correct? Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
Fantastic. Again, we'll move on. Lots of information ahead of you. So we're moving over to the Hep C direct acting antivirals. I direct your attention to page 153 if you're following along in the packet on our website. And with that, we'll turn it over to Megan Herring, subject matter expert in this area.
Thank you, Roger. So this is the drug class literature scan for the hepatitis C direct acting antivirals. The last time this class was reviewed was in June of 2020. Next slide. There was one high quality systematic review identified. This was prepared by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. It was prepared for the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force guidelines for screening for hepatitis C virus. After a literature search, 97 studies were included. Overall, most DAA trials were not randomized and did not have a non-DAA comparison group. And the primary outcome in almost all of the studies was sustained virologic response, or SVR. There was high strength evidence from 49 trials that found that the DAA regimens resulted in a pooled SVR rate between 95.5% to 98.9% in the treatment of chronic hepatitis C virus across all genotypes, with low rates of serious adverse events, about 1.9%, and withdrawal due to adverse events of 0.4%. The most common reported adverse events were fatigue, headache, nausea, diarrhea, and insomnia. Direct evidence on the benefits of hepatitis C virus screening was unavailable, as well as direct evidence on the effects of DAA therapy on clinical outcomes remains limited, but does suggest improved long-term outcomes. And then low quality evidence from observational data does suggest that achieving SVR is associated with a decreased risk for all-cause mortality, liver-related mortality, cirrhosis, and hepatocellular carcinoma after adjustment for confounders. And there is insufficient evidence evaluating DAAs on reducing the risk of mother-to-infant transmission. Next slide. Both the CDC and the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force updated their or released guidelines that were really focused on screening. And so they were both consistent in recommending universal hepatitis C screening at least once in a lifetime for all adults, as well as for all pregnant women during each pregnancy. And they also recommend one-time testing for those with recognized risk factors and routine testing for persons with ongoing risk factors. Next slide. There were 2 new indications and 1 new safety warning identified. The FDA labeling of sofosbuvir velpatasvir, or Epclusa, was expanded in June to include pediatric patients aged 3 years of age or older with chronic hepatitis C virus genotypes 1 through 6. And a new formulation, an oral pellet packet, was also approved for pediatric patients. This is the only formulation available for those weighing less than 17 kilograms. Approval was based on a phase 2 open label trial in 41 children that demonstrated an SVR12 rate of 83%. The 7 patients who did not achieve SVR discontinued treatment within the first 20 days. There was a higher incidence of vomiting and spitting up the drug in the younger age group of those 3 to 6 years of age. And then the FDA labeling for glecaprevir, pibrentasvir, or Mavyret was also expanded to include pediatric patients ages 3 years of age and older, as well as a new formulation for pediatric patients and for only available for those weighing less than 45 kilograms. Approval of this was based on a phase 2/3 non-randomized open label study in children ages 3 to 12 years of age, including a cohort of 24 patients ages 3 to 6. And the overall SVR rate was 96%, and in those ages 3 to 6-year-old, the SVR rate was 95% at a dose of 50 and 20 milligrams. And the most common adverse events were headache that occurred in about 14% of children, vomiting, and diarrhea. And then there was 1 new addition to the FDA warning and precautions in the labeling for abasvir, grazoprevir, including the risk of hepatic decompensation in patients with evidence of advanced liver disease. And we do already include this in our PA criteria. Next slide. Moving on to current data in the treatment of recently acquired or acute hepatitis C virus. This topic has come up at previous meetings, and the committee had decided to continue to approve treatment for only chronic hepatitis C to allow for the possibility of spontaneous clearance that can occur in anywhere from 20 to 50% of individuals with recently acquired hepatitis C virus. At the time of that last review, the evidence conclusions were mostly based on a Cochrane systematic review that concluded insufficient evidence to evaluate the use of direct-acting antivirals in the treatment of acute hepatitis C. So since then, there has been some identified data included in this table. As you can see, 3 of the studies are single-arm open-label studies, and most of them are looking at shorter durations of DAA than what are recommended in chronic hepatitis C virus. And then in the 3rd row, the study by Matthews is the only randomized trial. And this study did compare Epclusa 6 weeks versus 12 weeks in individuals who were recently acquired hepatitis C virus. And as you can see in the results on the right column, the SVR rate was 81.7% in those who received 6 weeks versus 90.5% in those who received 12 weeks of therapy. And this did not meet the criteria for non-inferiority. And the trial this was interim, an interim analysis. The trial was stopped early due to the increase of relapse in the group that received 6 weeks of treatment. Next slide. And then in terms of guideline recommendations for recently acquired hepatitis C, guidelines from the VA, the American Association for the Study of Liver Diseases, and the European Association for the Study of Liver all now recommend treatment of recently acquired or acute hepatitis C virus without waiting for a spontaneous resolution due to the increased risk of losing the patient if deferred for longer, as well as the decreased risk of transmission, along with the high SVR rates with the DAA regimens and low side effect profile. The biggest uncertainty in the guidelines is the treatment duration and if shortened treatment durations are effective for acute hepatitis C virus. The AASLD and VA guidelines recommend the same regimens and durations that are currently recommended in chronic hepatitis C until more definitive data are available. And the European guidelines recommend 8 weeks of Sothvel or Glecpiv Mavyret, pending additional data on the ideal treatment duration in this group. Next slide. Our recommendations are to update the prior authorization criteria and treatment table to include the new pediatric indications and clerical updates and to review comparative costs in executive session. Next slide. This is just from the PA criteria that is on page 169. This is just some minor clerical updates in question number 4 to provide some further clarification on when genotype testing is needed. And so just to include those who have decompensated cirrhosis and treatment experience with the DAA regimen, since those who are treatment experienced with interferon are treated as treatment naive. And then a footnote at the bottom, just providing more definition of treatment experience. This question has come up about the criteria for patients who may have started and stopped treatment before 4 weeks. So defining treatment experience as those patients who receive more than 4 weeks of DAA therapy. And then I apologize, I didn't include it on the slide, but the treatment regimen tables, which are on page 172, I think, were also updated, really just simplified, since most of the regimens that we are using are pan-genotypic. So instead of having a complex table based on genotype, it is simplified to just say treatment naive versus treatment experienced. And then I also updated the table to the recommended treatment regimens and dosing in pediatric patients based on the new data and FDA approved indications.
Thank you, Megan. Lots of information. Questions from the committee for Megan? All right, hearing none, we do have a bit of public comment. Just want to remind the folks that at this point, Thomas, in order to provide public comment, I'll call up you shortly, make you a co-host so that you can unmute yourself. If you wish to provide public comment and signed up in advance and didn't receive a confirmation email from me, there were some logistical issues with our emails. Please message Sarah Fletcher while we have the other commenters speak. So at this point, I want to recognize Dr. Ullman. Third time's a charm. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, Roger. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you loud and clear once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am Dr. Margaret Ullman from Medical Affairs at AbbVie. I would like to thank Dr. Herrick for her review and thank the committee for having Mavyret available as a pan-genotypic treatment option for HCV patients without cirrhosis or with compensated cirrhosis. Mavyret is the only once-daily pan-genotypic ribavirin-free regimen that is FDA approved to treat adults and now pediatric patients down to age 3 with chronic hepatitis C virus across all genotypes 1 through 6. For complete safety and full prescribing information, please refer to rxabbvie.com. As you decide the next steps for treatment of patients with HCV in Oregon, I respectfully request that you keep Mavyret available as a preferred medication. I'll give the rest of my time back to the committee after I answer any questions that you might have.
You got me multitasking, Margaret. Yeah. Any questions for Dr. Ullman? All right, hearing none. We also have Dr. Ann Thomas from our own public health. Dr. Thomas, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am.
All right, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just kind of wanted to review kind of my feelings about dropping prior authorization requirements, in particular those for against treating acute hepatitis C. As we've already seen, you know, AASLD and other groups do allow for initiating treatment following a single positive hep C RNA, because we know that the majority will still be viremic in 6 months. And I think in many cases, the people, if you refuse treatment for someone who's only had a single positive hep C RNA, actually 90% of those people are probably represent chronic cases. We only identify 25 or 30 of true acute hep C each year in our state. However, by dropping this requirement, we will improve rates of treatment. This will really increase the ability to link hard to reach populations to care if they don't have to wait 6 months for a second positive RNA. And I can tell you from a public health standpoint, treatment at the time of initial diagnosis reduces the time period that the individual is viremic. So this practice will reduce transmission among high-risk individuals. We know that the prevalence of hep C is highest in baby boomers, but there's not much transmission in this age group. In contrast, the rates of newly diagnosed cases in people under the age of 30 have been increasing in Oregon, and they commonly occur in people who are actively injecting drugs, who are at the highest risk of transmitting the infection. This group also encompasses many women of childbearing age. So by treating young women at the first diagnosis of hep C while they are not pregnant, you can ultimately impact and decrease the rate of perinatal transmission. And then lastly, although the pandemic has interfered with my ability to publicize this data, in 2019, we worked with a disease modeling group to estimate how many people in Oregon are chronically infected with hep C and how many we would need to treat annually to eliminate hep C in Oregon. And the numbers are actually quite feasible. They estimated that 57,000 Oregonians had viremic infections in 2018. And just to fulfill your curiosity, 20% of those were Medicaid patients. And if we treat between 3,000 to 5,000 patients with VAAs each year between 2020 and 2030, we could decrease total infections in Oregon by 50,000 to 65,000. So that really gets us to our elimination goal. However, and in fact, we know from APAC data, the most recent data I have is from 2019, we did treat 4,000 Oregonians that year. So ultimately, the success of elimination will hinge on our ability to prevent new cases, and which is why I'm really kind of pushing the concept of treatment as a prevention strategy in this high-risk group. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Again, opportunity for the committee to ask questions of Dr. Thomas. Okay. All right, there may be additional questions. Next, I would have Dr. Andy Seaman. He is Old Town Clinic, Central Cities Concern. I didn't have a conflict of interest declaration. I know you're assistant professor with OHSU. Dr. Seaman, for the committee's sake, do you receive any funding from industry? That's important for them to understand, but it doesn't include you from testifying.
Yes, I do. I receive Gilead Focus Foundation funding for a screening program, and that's it at this point.
No worries. And again, just out of respect for everybody else and still things to go on the agenda, if you can keep it limited to 3 minutes, great. I know you have a lot of points you want to touch on, so the floor will be yours. And then understanding that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers from the committee after you're done. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Dr. Seaman.
Great, thank you so much. And I think Ann Thomas summarized this really well. I think the things I would add on to what Dr. Thomas said about the removal of the requirements for delay of treatment for people who have acute hepatitis C are that, I think the key to treating this population is immediate treatment. You have to treat people when they're in your hands. We at Central City Concern have treated more people who use drugs by far than anyone else in the state. And we do that by creating these streamlined protocols so that when we have someone in hand, when they're there and they're with us, we can treat them very quickly. Everything is teed up. And when you tell someone they have to defer 6 months, we very, very often lose them. I think the other thing that Dr. Thomas mentioned a little bit was that there are several modeling studies out there that look at treatment of acute hepatitis C and suggest that it's really crucial to treat this population to eliminate hepatitis C. And it may, in fact, be cheaper than not doing so in the long run. By definition, people who inject drugs who have an acute hep C transmission, they are not only engaging in some general risk behavior for hepatitis C, but high risk as they had recently transmitted. So we don't know to the degree that they have a higher risk than their average person who injects drugs, but they likely have quite a bit higher risk. And so it really is urgent to make this change and has very little additional cost to the system. The second thing I want to focus on is we are really at a time when we need to remove the prior auth altogether. So far, 8 states have done so, including California, New York, and others. And this is because treatment is safe, it's not complicated anymore, and it has myriad health benefits. And much more complicated, similarly expensive medicines like antiretroviral therapy for HIV do not require prior auth in Oregon. This is really just a relic of the previous cost and complexity of DAA treatment, and it's time to make this change. Prior auths are also a barrier to initiating treatment in general. And again, the key to elimination is treating people in real time. We have new screening tools that allow us to do this much more easily. And I have treated, again, over 1,000 people who use drugs. I'm an international expert in developing models of care for hep C elimination. And I can tell you that all of the evidence interest in this community is how do you treat people immediately? The prior auth is a huge barrier to doing so. And I'm also the director of the hepatitis C ECHO in Oregon and have been for 3 years. And I'll tell you that this is a very frequently cited reason why people do not treat hepatitis C or treat in a very limited fashion. Because if they start treating people in a really escalated fashion or develop elimination programs, they have to hire staff that are not reimbursed to manage the prior auth process. And in all of this is limiting our ability to treat people in rural Oregon, where we have very, very poor access still for hepatitis C treatment. So let's not go back to the 2017 time again when we were in the worst, one of the worst ranked states in the country for HCV treatment access, and let's remove the prior auth again.
Appreciate your comments, Dr. Seaman. Open it up to the committee for any questions for Dr. Seaman.
Andrew, I just want to thank you for those impassioned comments on behalf of the patients you serve. I really felt that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Again, this was not part of our recommendations, but Dr. Seaman and Dr. Thomas coming forward and asking, one, consider treating acute, or beyond that, removing PA criteria altogether from the preferred agents, in which case it would allow for acute treatment in a timely fashion. So again, it's within the 30 days that we posted this information, but we wanted to provide an opportunity. And as a reminder, the committee, all written comments that have come in from outside parties have been shared with you to review in advance, and those are posted to our website as well. So again, we do have one more public commenter, but any questions from the committee for Dr. Seaman or Thomas?
I don't have exactly a question, but more of a comment. So in our clinic, or our 6 clinic locations, most of which are rural, the pharmacists do all of the hepatitis C management. And I can say honestly, if I would definitely be in support from a practice side of things of removing those PA criteria. I know it's more complicated than that, but I just want to throw that out there. There are delays. I mean, getting prior authorizations, while it's much faster than it used to be, it does certainly delay therapy. And if we could have our patients leave that initial visit with their medications, that certainly would improve our overall outcomes. So
along those lines, again, for the committee, part of our PA criteria supports the risk corridor by which the CCOs must follow the fee-for-service PDL and follow the PA criteria. Part of that criteria requires case management. So that there's some way to track members that are being followed so that the CCOs that are getting either reimbursement for additional expenditures reflecting that they actually are following these numbers. Any concerns with case management concerns with these recommendations that are being put forward?
I'm not sure who that question's for, but for us, it would.
I'm just throwing it out there to say, you know, we have here, we're looking, what we brought forward as staff for the OHA is surely based upon some of the changes for approval and criteria and ages, right? And what is being requested here by Dr. Thomas and Stephen is to remove criteria altogether, or at least to treat acute. And there is, you know, we can't ignore the fact that there is a risk corridor that has some requirements upon the CCOs. If we were to open access, what might that look like? And maybe that's a question for the CCO. So I'm trying to look at this from all angles.
I mean, I can speak to it. It wouldn't change our practice. I mean, we do the case management, we do the follow-ups, we do the SVRs. We've been, I know the numbers. We've been successful in keeping track of people once we get them started. Almost all of our folks are lost from the time that we see them to the time that they start therapy. So at least, and we're a small group, we're not treating thousands of people, but I absolutely would say that, I don't see anybody dropping the case management requirements because it's such an important part of the overall treatment success.
Stacy, just so I'm hearing what you said is, when you get a prescription, your clinic is responsible for tracking them, but you lose them immediately?
No, we don't. But I think that the people, we don't lose them immediately, but we have had several people who are, let's say, I see them on Friday, we submit a PA, they are supposed to come back and pick up their medication the following week. That's the place where we see most of our folks not come back and pick up their prescription. So not a lot. But again, I think if I could hand them their filled prescription that first day after we've had our initial consult, I just feel like that would. So
it's less about the case management. What I'm hearing you say is the barrier of the PA is limiting or providing a blockage for the member of accessing their medication and starting treatment.
Yeah, it's not a giant number. Most of the folks we see are motivated, and we keep in pretty close contact with them. So, it'd be interesting to hear from folks who maybe have a larger sample size. I'm all for, removing whatever barriers we can.
Dr. Thiemann, please.
Question.
Yes. So I think that I think there are a lot of ways you can manage that. I think we can maintain the benefits of the risk corridor and the case management, and I think there's some real benefits to that. Some of the incentivization for the CCOs to meet targets. Especially some of the rural CCOs that do really hands-on case management. I think those are good things. I don't think a prior auth is necessary to achieve that. I think there are lots of other ways to notify case management. There are other ways that CCOs have of tracking these prescriptions. So I think that with a little creativity and time, I think we could very easily achieve the same goal without some of the barriers that the prior auths present.
Appreciate that. And again, you're in a unique setting. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions for our staff. Do we have any way of knowing how many of the folks who submit prior auths never get the drug? Because I would think, do we track that? Because that would be a real clear evidence of an impediment. And
so you're saying for a member for whom a claim got denied, the provider was notified by the pharmacy, and they requested PA, they never went and picked up the drug.
Right. Is that something we track? Or can track?
Well, if the pharmacy fills the claim once they've received a prior authorization, we can't track it. It looks like a filled script, right? It's an interesting question. If we receive a denied claim and no follow-up, we can track that as well. But what you're asking for is denied claim, provider then requests a PA, which members have a PA loaded and we have no subsequent claim.
Right, because if the PA is if the PA is a barrier, we should have a number of folks who get it authorized and then don't get the drug, and that's not good. But I don't know.
Well, the actual PA barrier would be that it would never be requested, would be my anticipation. That they take the prescription to the pharmacy, try to fill it, it gets denied. The standard of practice is then the pharmacy would contact the prescriber, and either one, they didn't contact the prescriber, or they did, and the prescriber never contacted the PA unit and requested PA. So it's never loaded. So all we would see was an index claim for a denied prescription. What you're describing is the pharmacy contacted the prescriber contacted the PA unit, and they loaded a PA. And then we see no follow-up claim because it was never communicated to the member. That's kind of a third little bucket. And I appreciate that. That's really important because that's, go ahead, Bill.
It's a lot more complicated than I thought, because I was assuming that everyone who prescribed this stuff knew to get a prior auth, but that may be a false assumption.
Yeah. Dr. Seaman, I'm reading your comments, trying to do this as well, but you want to voice any other comments to the committee?
Thank you. I think you covered many of them too. I think that the barriers of a PA go far beyond the actual submission, but I do think the data that you requested, sir, I think it would be an interesting supplementary piece of information. But they also, there are people who, like you said, Roger, never submit the PAs because of, there may be labs that are requested. People don't complete all of the labs, but you still have enough labs to actually treat the hepatitis C, and so on. And then providers, again, may actually not start prescribing because of the systemic barriers. We are still seeing the relics of the old PAs in that people are not treating people who use drugs still. I have conversations monthly with rural providers around that. And so I think the overarching picture is, especially removing the PA and then messaging on that would have a really significant impact on our ability to eliminate.
I'm still trying
Dr.
to
Seaman, good, Bill.
I'm still trying to get some data on this, because this is like a lot of things. The theory is very sensible, but I have no idea what actually happens because nobody tracks all this. And there are some things that are perceived as barriers that really aren't. And it's more complex.
I will say that the prior authorization process is so much smoother than it used to be. And I think that for those of us that are treating Hep C, we know what the insurer needs. It's included in our chart notes in our initial visit. So I do want to say that the process in and of itself has become so much better, but there's still, I still think that there's an opportunity to improve.
Stacy, how do we at Oregon Health Plan Medicaid compare to commercial plans in both requesting prior authorizations and getting it done? Are we the same, better, or worse, or under?
So in my experience, we are better. And I will say, and that goes for both the CCOs and our open card patients. Our commercial patients seem to have, I mean, there's more hoops to go through. Often there are plans that require specialty pharmacy mail meds to the patient, which we don't love. So there are certainly, I would say we certainly, in my experience, are better than commercial plans, for sure.
Thank you.
Karen, and then Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to say that I feel that we have evidence-based criteria for the prior authorization process, and the prior authorizations, there's a requirement that they're completed within 24 hours by fee-for-service as well as the CCOs. So with regard to the timeliness, I mean, those are actually a very timely process. And I understand that it can, that there's a workload that comes with submitting the prior authorization, but submitting prior authorizations for coverage of medications is just part of the pharmacy benefit management process. So while it's inconvenient, I feel like it's just, I mean, it's part of the process that's kind of here to stay to ensure medically appropriate and clinically appropriate services for patients across all benefit structures. So I wouldn't be
appreciate that,
supportive
Karen,
of
but just to
removing
clarify,
criteria.
yeah, I appreciate that, but just to clarify, that 24-hour time limit is for the payer to respond. It still requires a prescription going to the pharmacy, that being communicated to the prescriber then reaching out to the PA unit, and then the PA unit has 24 hours to respond. And I think what Dr. Seaman is arguing here is they've got a member in front of them for whom I have identified an opportunity to treat, and they want to take advantage of that.
I understand, but also the providers, the hepatitis C providers that I've worked with in our community are all well aware that prior authorizations are required for the medications. And when the patients are part of case management, those prior authorizations can get started proactively so that the claims actually process when they get to the pharmacy. So, so
appreciate that.
It is a
yep.
pretty,
and that
can be a timely process if it's orchestrated correctly.
And that wraps the member in support. So I appreciate that. Sarah Servid?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak briefly to the numbers of patients that we have on hepatitis C direct-acting antivirals. We aren't able to see PA requests for CCO members or denied PAs or denied claims for CCO members, but we do track that in fee-for-service. And there's small numbers because we've got a pretty small population in fee-for-service, but of the so for example, in the second quarter of this year, we had 16 patients that had paid or denied claims. 5 of them had an initial paid claim. 7 of them got a paid claim within a month after that first denial. 1 of them got a subsequent paid claim, again falling within that first month. 3 patients, and so this would be the population that I'm a little more concerned about. 3 patients didn't have any paid claim for a direct-acting antiviral within 90 days after their first denial, and so 3 out of a total of 16 patients is 20%. So it's a pretty big percentage, but small numbers overall.
Karen, your hand's still up. Please go ahead.
I think I just had not, I don't have anything else to add.
No worries.
I hadn't lowered my hand.
Thomas?
My apologies.
Okay. No worries. Dr. Thomas, I see you have some comments. Can you please vocalize those for the committee for consideration?
Thank you. Yeah, this, I think what I'm going to say might seem a little bit veering off the topic, but I just wanted to point out the value of DAA treatment in Oregon. I was actually surprised to see Megan's presentation that there still isn't any, good studies showing the long-term impact of these drugs. But what I can tell you is from all payers, all claims data that, in the early teens in Oregon, only a couple hundred people a year got treated. And that jumped up to 2,500 in 2015 and hovered around, about 2,500, 2,600 for the next few years. And then in 2018, 3,000 people were treated. And in 2019, just over 4,000 were treated. And although I usually frown at ecologic data, I can tell you that, using our death certificate data, that deaths associated with hepatitis C have started to level off for the first time in years. And similarly, I haven't been able to, I've looked at the liver cancer data from the Oscar registry. And although I don't have the data to know whether they had hepatitis B or C or not, liver cancer rates have leveled off for the first time in years. So even by just treating a few thousand people a year, we're making a big impact. And so I want you to realize that this is one very valuable thing to do. And the numbers aren't numbing. It's not like we need to treat 20,000 people a year. It's like, what the modeling suggests, and kind of, very crudely from this ecologic analysis that's, done on the back of a cocktail napkin, really a couple thousand a year overall for the state will make an impact. And I think really for this sort of young active injection drug user population that Dr. Seaman is talking about, again, it's not like we're going to treat 1,000 active injection drug users a year. I mean, this is, I mean, a few hundred a year would make a dramatic difference, I think, in the trajectory of the epidemic and really do more to decrease transmission than, you know, I mean, certainly we still have a huge faith and a need for harm reduction, but this can really make a difference. And Dr. Seaman can tell you more eloquently than I can about how treatment in someone who's actively using really can change their mindset, and they typically become more interested in not getting infected again, and that often kind of puts them on the pathway to being, you know, seeking treatment for their substance use disorder. So I think this is actually a fairly small ask that has a big impact.
I appreciate that, Dr. Almas. Before we go to further questions, I wanted to respectfully allow time for Lauren Sant from Caring Ambassadors. She also signed up to provide public comment. She submitted some written comments that I sent to the committee to review in advance. Those we posted to our website. As far as conflicts of interest, Lauren discloses that she's fully conflicted. She gets money from everybody, right, Lauren? So I'll leave that to you. And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but I appreciate all the great work that you do. And while you're fully conflicted, you're not conflicted at all. You're just caring about people with hepatitis and HIV and doing the great work. So with that, are you able to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Roger. Appreciate it. My name is Lauren.
Yeah, you bet.
I'm the executive director of the Caring Ambassadors program, and we're a national nonprofit advocacy based out of Oregon City. And I do appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And as Roger said, I do take money from every pharmaceutical company I can because we're a nonprofit, but no one has asked me to speak today or paid me to speak today. And I have submitted written testimony, but I just want to go over a couple of points and basically the same thing that you heard from Ann and Andy. But first, I really want to recognize and thank you for the increases in care and cure that you've already allowed to happen for hepatitis C patients by the restrictions that you have removed to date. So thank you. But we still have barriers like the PA and acute hepatitis C. Secondly, I really want to thank you for the proposed guidelines for treating children. This is unfortunately a growing population, and with the new DAAs, we can cure these people before we have any complications from them living with the virus for decades. So, but with that, we've request that the Medicaid program allow full access to FDA-approved direct-acting antivirals by removing the prior authorization criteria, as 8 other states have already done. Oregon does not require a PA for primary care to treat HIV, and this is a health equity that needs to be corrected. Additionally, providing treatment for all people, that has been said, not differentiating between acute and chronic, because according to AASLD, acute hepatitis C infection is a chronic problem. And treating acute infection, Ann didn't mention this, but it's in her presentation. It's also a health equity issue because Native Americans and Black Oregonians are disproportionately affected by acute and chronic hepatitis C, and they have the highest mortality rates in our state from hepatitis C. And so, you know, Oregon may not be on a target for elimination right now, but we could be. The data that is coming out of Andrew's group and out of Oregon Hope Study and out of studies like New York, the Accessible Care Study, show how if you reduce the barriers to care, the results of numbers being cured increases dramatically. And real quickly, one of the peers from Southern Oregon that works in the Oregon Hope Study said, some of my clients have sought treatment for Hep C in the past and were told they cannot be treated till they're drug-free. They're turned down for treatment. The providers are not aware of the recent changes. Even if they are, they may not want to treat these people. It goes around into the community. The people believe they're not aware of treatment and they'll just be denied. Her quote is, the Oregon Hope research study on using telemedicine to treat people in Hep C is a huge success in getting my clients cured. Thank you. So thank you. Roger, I can keep talking if you want, but I tried to behave.
Oh, I'm talking on mute. I just wanted to say thank you, Lauren, for taking the time to be here. You've always been a strong advocate. I said I was noticing Tim's head on our P&T committee nodding, agreeing with this. I didn't know if you wanted to have any comment, Tim. Dale, you probably have some comments as well, but really appreciate, Lauren, Doctors Thomas, and Seaman for being here today to talk about this important issue. Tim, you want to say anything?
No, I just agree that, having good access and payment is really important. I guess my only other thought would be, if we're going to keep the PA process, just streamline as much as possible. I wish they can just, since we pay for the lab work and all the diagnostic criteria, that we can just shut that straight into the PA algorithm on OHA side, so that our provider teams don't have to do all that work to get it to the team to make the decision.
Bill? Mute.
I'm for anything that streamlines things. The problem that I see is if we open up anything, then anyone with a medical license can prescribe things.
Well, we can barely hear you. It's like a whisper.
Excuse
Sorry.
me, I need to get close to the microphone. That's
If you
it.
could repeat what you said.
Yeah, the challenge is that if something is open access, anyone with a license can prescribe it. And I have no concern about the people we talked to today and their choice in what they're doing. And I don't know how to solve that dilemma.
I'm going to throw just one more twist in here, even though we're behind agenda. And Dr. Seaman, I hope you're still on. We have a new dried blood spot test that's somewhat of a real-time ability, and I don't know enough about it to be conversant in it. But Andy, if you could touch on that to identify members for whom you know they are positive for Hep C that you're trying to access treatment for, and I think that piggybacks on top of your request to, in those cases, provide access immediately for them to get preferred agents.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for calling that out. So first, I just really quickly, in response to Dr. Order, I think if anyone with a license could prescribe, that would be wonderful. I mean, the truth is that you could pick up a pangenotypic regimen and you could throw it at anyone with a positive RNA, and 95% of the time you'd be great. It is so much simpler than almost anything else. This is a cure. This isn't a management. People's depression gets better. Their bipolar disorder gets better. Their diabetes gets better. They're less likely to get blood cancers, renal cancer, you name it. This is not a liver disease. This is a systemic inflammatory disease that makes people who use drugs feel awful about themselves. They embody systemic trauma, all of the trauma of their highly stigmatized use. So I hear that, and I think the burden is on the PA, is on the state to show that the PA is helping care. And I would say that it's really not. But to your question, so dried blood spot is something, so just to clarify slightly, it's not a point of care test. It is a community collected finger stick test that they send into the lab. So unfortunately, it's not real time, although there are real-time tests coming. But what it does allow us to do is we screen people on the street, we screen people in opioid treatment programs and other places where they can't get access to labs. There's a substantial contingent of people who are younger and uncomplicated, who there's really no reason you couldn't give them a non-protease inhibitor pangenotypic regimen without any other lab work and treat them. There are plenty of models of care. There's a model, I'm chairing a conversation at INSU in Australia next week around this, and there are people who are presenting on all of these different ways of just giving meds to anyone who has a positive RNA. So that's where we're headed. And DBS, the dried blood spot, will not solve the real-time solution. The only test out there that does that is something from CFIUD called GeneXpert, which is not available here in the US yet. It's also quite expensive. But it is something that allows us to, maybe diagnose someone on the street and meet them there a week later and give them their medicines. So really, this is just, it's another tool to allow us to get creative in how we do this and empower people who use drugs to be part of the process. All right, thank you.
I appreciate that, Andy. And that kind of, I was confused. So maybe I misunderstood. So if you have a member in front of you for whom you're considering providing a DAA prescribing, how do you know? Why are you prescribing the DAA? Did you have some testing that, how do you know that they have hepatitis if
Well,
it's
I
not
think,
real time?
yeah, so you won't. We're not proposing that. We're proposing that when people come back through and they have a diagnosis, many people could get treatment without getting liver tests and all those sorts of things. And so that's one way it could be used. But then there are also just people who, most systems don't have a system like ours where we, do all of the pre-work, pre-populate the script, get the prior auth done prior to someone even coming back in to look at their lab tests. So that's why we are so successful. So we sort of mitigate some of the troubles with the prior auth, but most systems can't do that. All of the systems I work with in rural Oregon, they don't have the capacity, the bandwidth, the funding to do that. So I think for me, it's not a huge barrier and that's why we've started 90% of people we diagnose on treatment. But if you look at the community, it's a huge barrier. Does that make sense?
Okay. No, it does. It helps me because I was confused about the timing of when you were testing the person, how you knew and when you were prescribing the medication. But you're talking about a second touch. That member already had the lab work. They're coming back in. You have some established relationship. And now you're saying, I want to prescribe this, but I don't want to go through the barrier. Not that you want to. I don't want to charge that it's appropriate and I want to give this medication to the member. Is that relatively correct?
That is relatively correct, yes. Thank you, Roger.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Bill.
Do we have any data from the states that have opened access? It would seem that should be a source of information. What's happened?
So we've asked for that. Unfortunately, this is all a relatively new thing. And as everyone knows, what happened in the last 2 years, everything that was non-essential, no one did. So hepatitis C treatment rates have really fallen across the country. And so in New York, California, when we've asked for, they don't have the data, or the data looks worse than they would expect. And that's because, no one was getting screened, no one was getting treated. So we won't know really for probably a couple of years.
So any other questions from the P&T committee? All right, to keep us on task, we're a little behind schedule as anticipated. We've had some great discussion. The recommendations in front of the committee are to update the PA criteria and treatment table to include the new pediatric indications, right, and clerical updates. And we'll review the comparative costs in executive session. Vitally important to make sure that we can keep leveraging supplemental rebates and notify the CCOs. So I think that's the first ask. The second ask that I want to parse out separately is to consider and see if there's a motion to consider removing PA criteria altogether, or in lieu of that, to be consider treating acute members. But let's take the first recommendations that we have with the evidence in front of you, the recommendations on the screen.
Hey, Roger, just a point of clarification. So,
please.
These are, so if we approve this, it doesn't preclude us still moving forward and looking at removing the PA criteria?
No, correct. We're just updating the PA criteria, and this would still apply to non-preferred agents, right? It would prefer, it'd still apply to all sorts of different things. We have the criteria. We want to make sure that this doesn't. I have to make sure that you understand. So separately, and the reason that I parse out what Dr. Seaman and everybody, Dr. Thomas are talking about with treating acute or removing criteria, is a recommendation to the OHA to consider, and they have to understand. You have to understand that there is a risk corridor that has been instrumental in making sure that the state is in concert when we're treating different stages of disease, and that the CCOs aren't on the hook if they have huge expenditures, right? The risk corridor protects both the OHA and the CCOs. What would be considered with a recommendation to treat acute or remove criteria probably has financial implications of which I'm not aware. So all I'm saying is I think it's important to keep those separate, that we want to take what we've got currently and improve it and update it with what's the recommendation in front of you. And then separately, see if your thoughts on what's been presented by Dr. Seaman, Thomas, and Lauren Sand.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying. I appreciate it.
You bet. So with the recommendations in front of you, we can move forward with a move to approve.
So this is Karen, and I move to approve that we update the prior authorization criteria and treatment table to include the new pediatric indications and the clerical updates.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
Now, independent of that is the consideration that were proposed by Drs. Thomas, Seaman, and championed by Lauren Sand. Any thoughts, questions, motions?
I think it's an excellent idea, but I'd certainly like more information to know if we're going to solve a problem with this or not.
Okay, and we can dig into that in a second. Anybody else?
I'm obviously supportive. I'm not sure I can make a motion as the chair, but I absolutely would like to look at this or propose this and have the OHA take a look at removing PA criteria as well as treating acute infections.
You know, what I would like to do is move forward on looking at the implications and the practicalities of that. And is it something that we have the budget to do?
And that's both a clinical and financial request. Appreciate that, Bill, which is always important, right? But it's not only something the committee can recommend. Well, you can recommend it to the OHA, and then they can take it forward and look at it with actuarial services. Anybody else?
Can we recommend that they get us information about that? Can they do some kind of modeling or something that can give us something from the perspective of underwriting?
I can't speak for the OHA. We can take your request forward and they will. So what I'm hearing is we move forward with the recommendations that we have. But there is a move to approve the OHA considering the financial opportunity to treat acute or remove PA altogether and then bring that back to the committee or to move forward. So it's either you're telling the OHA, we think this is a good idea, right? You're not a bean counter, or you're telling the OHA, yeah, either go forward or bring it back to us. Clinically, what you've heard from Dr. Seaman and Dr. Thomas and Lauren, do you think it makes sense for that to make the recommendation to say, yeah, go pursue this, investigate, and proceed if warranted, or do you want to see it back in your plate?
Well, this is sort of untried territory.
It is. It has been the whole time for 8 years now, maybe.
And I honestly don't know if this is going to have the benefit it wants or not, because everybody blames PA, and it is certainly an obstacle, but I don't know if it is the obstacle here, because I'm hearing from the people who are very sophisticated at it, they are very good at jumping through the hoops. And then,
well, in any event, we have a risk corridor. We have the CCOs. It takes notification. I'm hearing you tell us, go investigate this, that you're intrigued by this proposal, bring it back.
Yeah, let's consider this a very good idea that we want to talk about the implementation of. Because I think it's an excellent idea.
All right.
I'm in agreement with Bill on that. This is Kathy.
All right. That requires no action on behalf of the OHA.
Roger, could we, I guess, could we consider the moving forward with acute treatment without the further analysis?
Question for the committee. If you have, yeah, if within the PA criteria, we ask for chronic Hep C. If a member has what would be defined as acute, should they be treated?
So what is our data on the success of acute treatment? Because most of the stuff we look at is chronic. Does it work? Are there, because what I've seen were some very, very small studies that were open label, and I wonder if it works. You know, I would assume it does, but we have to act on the basis of evidence, and if there's evidence it works, then we certainly ought to push for it. But I don't know if we have that evidence.
Yeah, I mean, there, like you said, most of the evidence is open label, small, single arm studies, so it's limited. The data that is available does show that it does work. And I think most of the data now is just looking at the optimal duration. So there isn't a lot of data looking at the like recommended 12-week or 8-week regimens that we currently would be using.
So we don't have an optimum regimen right now. We don't know what, it sounds to me like this is a work in a process, and once we have the data, we should be able to decide, and if it works out, we ought to cover it. But we don't cover a lot of other things based on this limited amount of data.
Dr. Seaman, again, appreciate your work, and this is, not how we usually operate, but please, this is important.
I appreciate that. just to be clear, there's just no biologic plausibility that treatment of acute hepatitis C versus chronic hepatitis C would be any different. It's the virus, it attacks the virus in the same way. If anything, it'd be more likely to cure it. And that's what Megan is alluding to, that the studies that look at optimal duration are all shorter duration, and they all tend to show better outcomes than you would expect with chronic hep C. So the only reason that we ever had this barrier is because of the cost of the initial regimen. So there's no plausibility that this would be something that wouldn't work. And a need for, say, new randomized controlled trials to do this is just really not going to happen, I think.
I beg to differ on that. There are a whole lot of things that we think ought to work that don't. And we are charged by the state with evaluating evidence. And that is our charge by what we signed up for. And I will evaluate evidence. And there are a whole lot of things that should work and do. And there are a whole lot of things that should work and don't. But I cannot make a decision for what I signed up for without the evidence.
Bill, I would say that what we're talking about, though, is a relic of history, not a lack of evidence. If the drugs for syphilis cost $84,000 a year when they came out, and we said we're only going to treat syphilis if it becomes chronic or this stage, then we might be asking the same question. But no one in there ever would suggest that we should not treat acute syphilis. And so it's the same thing. This is a public health disease. And so I hear you, but this is the biggest public health threat, infectious public health threat besides COVID, has been. And we have the third highest rates in the States. So I think this is not one of those things that we sit and wait for someone to design a questionably ethical 300-person randomized controlled trial. And I think that there is real urgency here, and every case we don't treat is probably several cases that we will have to treat later. And so that's what all the modeling studies show. We may not have that randomized data, but that's what all the modeling studies show us. So respectfully, I disagree on the data. I think we have plenty of data to make this decision.
Disagree, because this is what I signed up for, and things that work are very easy to prove. We were able to get some pretty good data on some effective treatment for COVID in a very short order. And so on one hand, I absolutely support the selfless work that you are doing for a very vulnerable population, but we still need to be data driven.
I appreciate all of that. So just to move us forward, we have moved forward with the recommendations that are on your screen for the updates to the PA criteria, and then we'll review in executive session. I think what I'm hearing in front of the committee is remove PA criteria altogether, and or begin to treat acute, right? And so is there a motion to consider those recommendations? And then alternatively, or in concert, we can go forward, my staff, can go forward and look for evidence of bringing this back subsequently. But what's in front of the committee is being proposed and being debated is, should we remove PA criteria for preferred agents? And should we treat acute hep C? Any motion?
Can I make the motion?
Yeah, you may.
Okay, yes, so moved. I would like to look at both of those things, and I think it could be two separate conversations. But yes, I would like to proceed. I would like to make a motion to proceed.
So
Well, not proceed. Are you moving
yes.
to remove
Yes, I'm
PA for preferred agents?
yes.
And are you moving for treatment of acute? Two
Yes.
separate motions.
Two separate motions,
Okay.
both motions.
All right. And Stacy's the chair, but I'll help her. Any second to either of those motions?
I will second the acute one.
So treat acute. Let's take that one first. So there's a motion to treat acute hepatitis C and a second.
I think there's a point of clarification from Tim.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I'm just trying to confirm, because I would be in support in the analysis of removing prior authorization and treating acute, but I think we also have to be stewards of the state dollars. And so I would prefer to have an analysis of what the implication is going to be. Is it going to bankrupt the role and we can't physically do it or not, I guess. So I guess I personally am a fan of actually having the analysis back from our team and then making this motion, but that's just what I wanted to say.
No, I appreciate that, Tim, and that's really an OHA decision, both within the risk corridor, financially. So the motion is in regards to your purview, which is PBL and PA criteria. There's a motion to remove restrictions to call out chronic. So we have a motion and a second, but I'm hearing you say you want more research, but you might be leaning towards not approving that at this point. So again, the motion, and just to clarify, is actually for the fee-for-service PA criteria that would be considered for the recommendations to the OHA that would then be considered and put out to the CCOs. But at this point, it was a recommendation is to remove the requirement that it's chronic Hep C. So let's take that one first. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor of removing chronic Hep C and treating acute? Opposed?
Nay.
Aye.
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 All right, I'm hearing voices for opposed at this time for change in the criteria. And then the second is to remove PA criteria altogether for preferred agents. Am I hearing a motion at this point to remove any requirements for prior authorization for preferred agents as a recommendation to the OHA?
Yes, I'm so moved, but
okay.
Yes.
Appreciate that, Stacey, and I'm kind of jumping in. Anybody second the requirement to remove requiring PA for any preferred agent, regardless, just open access for preferred agents?
I'm not sure if this fits into Robert's rules, but given that this is a pretty substantial change, I would recommend an opportunity for public comment and revisiting at the next P&T meeting. But maybe that
would be not that we're not moving to approve, that we're planning to bring back evidence anyway, Kat. I appreciate that. So I'm not hearing a second for removing PA. All right. What I'm hearing from the vote is for neither of these to move forward as a recommendation to the OHA at this time but for staff and the OHA to investigate both of these, to treat acute and to remove PA for preferred agents and bring this back at a subsequent meeting, in addition to evaluation of the financial implications for the OHA. While that might not be decided at the next P&T meeting, it certainly will be a consideration for the OHA to move forward. So, yeah, great discussion. Dr. Seaman, Dr. Thomas, Lauren, thank you for exploring this. I think within the context of the risk corridor, this is important discussion. I think we're moving it forward.
Thank you, and keep pushing us.
Absolutely. We're at 3:20. Let's take a 10-minute break. I'll work with my staff to see if we need to adjust any of our topics. We're behind schedule, clearly. So we might have to defer topics. At this point, we're looking like the Spravato safety update would be moved to the final topic, and we would refer that to or move that to a meeting in December. So at this point, again, let's take 10 minutes, go to 3:30, and we'll reconvene. Thanks, everybody. All right, welcome back. I hope we have a quorum. Let me see what I've got for the committee. All right, we're going to stick with the agenda. Granted, we're about 50 minutes behind schedule. We'll try to pick up the pace. I still anticipate we might not get to a topic or two, but with that, we'll turn it over to Sarah Servid. Direct your attention to page 175 of the packet.
Yeah, and I'm going to be talking today about a pulmonary hypertension class update. And so just a little bit of background on this topic. There are 5 different types of pulmonary hypertension depending on what the cause of the pulmonary hypertension is, and divided into World Health Organization groups 1 through 5. You can see them on the screen here. The current standards of care differ depending on the type of pulmonary hypertension, but it often does include supportive care such as oxygen or anticoagulants in patients with thrombotic risk, and diuretics if they have fluid retention. Historically, Group 1 and Group 4 are the only types of therapy that have targeted drug therapies associated with them with FDA-approved indications. Recently, and one of the rationales for this update was that inhaled treprostinil recently received FDA approval for pulmonary hypertension due to lung disease. So that's World Health Organization Group 3. pH-specific therapies are generally considered for symptomatic patients, and the types of different therapies that are available are listed here on the slide based on their mechanism of action. Our current policy for this class is we have intravenous epoprostenol preferred as a preferred IV formulation based on previous recommendations from the American College of Chest Physicians and the American College of Cardiology Foundation and American Heart Association. We also have preferred formulations for oral products that include bosentan and sildenafil. Looking at the evidence that was identified in this review, there were several systematic reviews that I want to touch on. One looked at targeted therapies for World Health Organization Group 1 for pulmonary arterial hypertension. They found that sildenafil might increase exercise capacity when compared to bosentan, but they also identified a trial that compared ambrisentan to tadalafil, in which there was no difference in exercise capacity between the two groups. They saw the IV prostanoid therapy probably has a larger treatment effect on exercise capacity, functional status, and mortality compared to other routes of administration in patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension for prostanoid therapy, but they did think that more direct comparisons between the different routes of administration were needed. Combination therapy with a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor may also have slight improvements in exercise capacity and quality of life compared to just monotherapy, but overall differences were small and failed to meet thresholds of clinical significance. And there was no difference in mortality between combination therapy and monotherapy with a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor. There were 2 systematic reviews that looked at pulmonary hypertension due to left heart disease, so Group 2 pulmonary hypertension. There aren't any currently therapies that are FDA approved for this population. One Cochrane review focused on use of phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors, and another review evaluated all targeted therapies. Both studies did show modest improvement in exercise capacity with no difference in mortality compared to placebo. However, authors of one systematic review concluded that they couldn't rule out an increased risk of mortality with targeted therapies based on some pre-specified sensitivity analyses that they did, which identified an increased risk of mortality upon exclusion of a single bosentan trial that compared bosentan to placebo. And of note, this trial, while it didn't show an increased risk of mortality, it did have an increased risk of hospitalizations associated with this therapy. One Cochrane review looked at pulmonary hypertension due to lung disease, so World Health Organization Group 3, and evaluated phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors compared to placebo. They didn't, so the review included 5 randomized controlled trials and found statistical improvements in World Health Organization of functional class and exercise capacity as measured by the 6-minute walking distance over 12 to 16 weeks. However, only one small study did evaluate functional class improvements, and magnitude of benefit for changes in 6-minute walking distance was small. And this study didn't identify any benefit compared to placebo for quality of life, and no studies evaluated mortality in this population. Phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors also had no difference compared to placebo in a systematic review that looked at World Health Organization Group 4 patients when evaluating outcomes of 6-minute walking distance, improvement in functional class, and quality of life based on low quality of evidence. Compared to bosentan, there was no statistical difference in the 6-minute walking distance or mortality with phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors. There were several new indications since the previous review. Oral extended release treprostinil tablets have received an expanded FDA-approved indication to delay disease progression in patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension. Treprostinil was previously indicated to increase exercise capacity in this population. In March 2021, treprostinil nebulized inhaled formulation received an expanded indication to improve exercise capacity in patients with pulmonary hypertension associated with interstitial lung disease. So that's World Health Organization Group 3. And most recently, in July of 2021, there was a new formulation of IV selexipag FDA approved, and oral selexipag tablets were previously approved for pulmonary arterial hypertension. The 2 new safety alerts that were identified are shown here on the screen. For iloprost, a new warning to avoid contact with skin and eyes and ingestion. And with tadalafil, labeling was updated to emphasize risk of drug interactions with concomitant organic nitrates. There are several randomized controlled trials, direct randomized controlled trials that I wanted to touch on. The first was a randomized controlled trial which looked at patients with symptomatic pulmonary arterial hypertension that had an intermediate risk of 1-year mortality, and patients were randomized to either remain on a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor or switch therapy to vericiguat. More patients who switched to vericiguat had a clinical improvement at 24 weeks, about 41% versus 20% of patients. But the conclusions from this trial are limited by the open label study design, which randomized patients to continue on a treatment when they already had symptoms on that treatment. There were also 2 pre-specified subgroup analyses of the AMBITION trial, which were published and evaluated combination tadalafil and ambrisentan compared to monotherapy in treatment-naive patients with World Health Organization functional class 2 or 3 symptoms. So those are patients with symptoms with mild symptoms or moderate symptoms in physical activity. The first analysis compared patients with and without cardiovascular risk factors. For both combination and monotherapy, clinical failure events were more common in patients with cardiovascular risk factors, and treatment was associated with more adverse events. And clinical failure events were primarily driven by hospitalization due to pulmonary arterial hypertension. The second analysis compared patients with functional class 2 or 3 symptoms. And in patients without cardiovascular risk factors, clinical failure events were less common in patients treated with combination therapy compared to monotherapy for both of those groups of patients for either class 1 or 2 symptoms. Class 2 or 3 symptoms. So based on this information, the recommendations are to update prior authorization criteria to include expanded indications, and no PDL changes are recommended based on the current evidence. So the changes to the prior authorization criteria are outlined here. Question 4, just clarifying that both riociguat or ambricetan are not recommended in patients with idiopathic interstitial pneumonias or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And then adding the new indication for nebulized treprostinil to question 10 in the criteria. I'll take any questions if people have them.
Questions for Sarah? All right, hearing none, we have Christine Hui with United Therapeutics. I've made you a co-host. Are you able to unmute yourself, Christine?
Hello, I'm here.
All right, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Hui, and I'm a medical science liaison with United Therapeutics. Tyvaso was first FDA approved in 2009 to improve exercise capacity in patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension. On March 31st, 2021, Tyvaso became the first and only FDA-approved therapy in the United States for the treatment of patients with pulmonary hypertension associated with interstitial lung disease to improve exercise ability. Pulmonary hypertension is a frequent complication of ILD that is associated with poor prognosis, worsened functional status measured by exercise capacity, increased supplemental oxygen needs, decreased quality of life, and reduced survival. Today, I'm going to go over the results from the INCREASE clinical study that was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine and serves as a basis for FDA approval of Tyvaso in patients with PH-ILD. The INCREASE study was the largest and most comprehensive completed study of adult patients with PH-ILD, with 326 patients randomized 1-to-1 to either Tyvaso or placebo. The primary efficacy endpoint was change in 6-minute walk distance at peak plasma Tyvaso exposure from baseline to week 16. At baseline, participants were on average 66 years of age with an average 6-minute walk distance of 260 meters. The most common etiologies of PH-ILD were idiopathic interstitial pneumonia, inclusive of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, combined pulmonary fibrosis and emphysema, and WHO group 3 connective tissue disease. The primary endpoint at week 16, patients who received Tyvaso had a placebo-corrected difference in peak 6-minute walk distance of 21 meters using Hodges-Lehmann estimate. Benefits of Tyvaso were observed across key secondary endpoints, including a 42% reduction in NT-proBNP when compared to placebo, and a 39% reduction in the risk of a clinical worsening event when compared to placebo. Additionally, patients receiving Tyvaso experienced significantly fewer exacerbations of underlying lung disease. 26.4% of Tyvaso patients experience an exacerbation compared to almost 39% of placebo patients. The safety profile of Tyvaso was consistent with previous studies, and most treatment-related adverse events were mild to moderate in intensity. Treatment discontinuation for any reason occurred in 24.5% of Tyvaso patients and 23.3% of placebo patients. Given the findings of the INCREASE study and lack of FDA-approved medications for PH and ILD, we ask that you move Tyvaso to preferred on the Oregon Medicaid PDL for PH-ILD patients that depend on your services. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Hui? All right, to remind you of the recommendations in front of the committee. Update the PEA criteria to include the expanded indications. We're not recommending any changes based on the current to the PDL based on the current evidence, and we will look at costs in executive session.
Do we have a motion?
Move to approve. So moved.
All those in, sorry, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
All right, moving on and directing your attention to page 196 in the packet posted online. We'll turn it over to Dr. Dave Engen.
All right, thank you, Roger. Yeah, today we'll be reviewing the Alzheimer's disease drug class. I move the next slide, please. I'll briefly discuss some of the newer literature for this class, and then we'll jump into the safety and efficacy of aducanumab. Next slide, please. Just first a little background. We know AD, it's a progressive disease, memory and neurological impairment, affects millions in the US and worldwide. AD treatment, it's mostly supportive, and we have a handful of therapeutic agents available, but these are generally more limited to symptom management. There's research to suggest that beta amyloid plaque buildup has a role in AD pathology, but to what extent is still pretty unclear. We're able to visualize beta amyloid plaque buildup in brain tissue with PET scans, and it's also detectable in cerebral spinal fluid in AD patients. However, there's still a lack of evidence to demonstrate that plaque removal actually improves outcomes in AD. So in fact, MRIs of AD patients have shown that therapies that are specifically targeted at beta amyloid may result in increased what we call ARIA events, notably brain swelling and microbleeds. You can go to the next slide. There were a handful of fairly recent systematic reviews that looked at a lot of the same studies regarding AD drug interventions, and in general, they found a similarly small magnitude of benefit for various cognitive and functional outcomes. We see acetylcholinesterase inhibitors beneficial in cognitive outcomes in mild, all the way up to in some cases, severe AD, notably donepezil. Donepezil has studies to confirm benefit in clinical and functional outcomes. And there's some evidence that galantamine and donepezil may have a higher risk of withdrawals due to adverse events, depending on what stage of AD it's used. And memantine was confirmed as a reasonable add-on to cholinesterase inhibitors in advanced AD. You can move to the next slide. We also had some nice guidelines that confirmed many of the drug treatment benefits we just looked at. Mostly it was recommended to start with cholinesterase inhibitor and eventually add memantine if needed. So really there's nothing too new to discuss there. We can move on to the next. So the newest addition to FDA-approved Alzheimer's disease agents is aducanumab, and trade names Aduhelm. It's an IgG1 monoclonal antibody. Reduces aggregated soluble and insoluble amyloid beta plaques in patients with Alzheimer's disease. It's indicated for the treatment of mild AD, because that's the population studied in the clinical trials. But its safety and effectiveness in earlier or later stages of AD is unknown. The FDA approval was based on two identical phase 3 randomized controlled trials. Study 301, known as ENGAGE. Study 302 is known as EMERGE. Patients with positive PET scan and mild cognitive impairment were randomized to low-dose aducanumab, high-dose aducanumab, or placebo. The primary outcome was change from baseline in mean score on the clinical dementia rating scale, sum of boxes, and that was at week 78. So just reminders, the CDR-SB, it's a measure of cognition, so memory, orientation, judgment, and that type of thing, as well as function in AD. And it's graded on a scale of 0 to 18, so higher is more severe disease. Study 301 failed to show a difference in CDR-SB scores for both the low and the high dose arms at week 78. However, study 302 it showed statistically significant changes from baseline in the CDR-SB score, but only in the high dose arm, not in the low dose arm. There were also some secondary outcome measures of cognition and activities of daily living. You can see listed there. They're also covered in more detail in your packet. Once again, no difference in the low or high dose group in study 301. And only in the high dose group, there's reported statistically significant changes from baseline for those particular secondary outcomes. That was for study 302. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. Being unpublished, the risk of bias could not be formally assessed, but regardless, there were numerous trial limitations. When there was early study termination, there was post hoc analysis and reevaluation of endpoints, multiple post hoc subgroup analysis, and of course there's missing data, inconsistency between similarly designed trials, and then there are surrogate endpoints with no direct correlation to clinical improvement. So those were a few of the limitations. There are also some significant safety issues reported, and it doesn't show. Yes.
I think it should be noted that both trials were terminated by safety committees due to futility.
That's correct. That's correct. Thank you. And that, yeah, if anyone would like more detail on that, I believe I pointed that out in the pack, but thank you for bringing that up here, Bill. I appreciate that. Just wanted to make sure on this slide, these are percentages. So we have some significant safety issues reported. So we have the ARIA events, headaches and falls topping the list. So you can see 35% for the ARIA E, so edema, headache, microhemorrhages and whatnot. So you can see the different percentages there. And we've addressed potential safety issues in the PA criteria that you'll review next. So let's go ahead and look at that. So we've created this, of course, to help ensure appropriate use. You'll notice a few areas in red font along the way. These are updates that are not currently in your packet, but they're updates based on feedback from specialists and industry comments after the final posting. So I wanted to make sure that was pointed out. First of all, it's standard. We ask for the diagnosis, and we want to ensure that other possibilities have been ruled out. So those are those first few questions. If you go to the next slide, questions 3 through 5, they're pretty standard with our and consistent with our PA criteria. But then we ask for specialist prescribing due to the complex testing and monitoring needed. And number 7, this ensures that the patient has mild disease with the recent assessment. And these are requirements that were consistent with a lot of the trial inclusion criteria. So you can see the different measurements and things that we would ask them, the prescriber, to provide to us there as a baseline. The next slide, 8 through 11, it deals mostly with baseline safety and efficacy. Help us know if the drug, is effective and not causing harm. So, of course, we want to see a baseline MRI, and that's standard, and that's in the prescribing information as well. Medication review for safety with appropriate documentation of plans for follow-up, and then as well as baseline cognitive and or functional assessments, so we can help determine efficacy if the drug is actually working. So that's kind of 8 through 11. If you look at the next slide, the renewal criteria, this is where we follow up on a lot of the earlier questions. So first of all, does the patient still have mild disease? Because that's the indication for the drug. We asked if there are follow-up safety MRIs, and that's consistent with the prescribing information as well. And there's, I believe on the earlier slide at the beginning, you can see a schedule for different, when we would ask that those MRIs are obtained. We can look back at that if you'd like. But basically we're asking, is the next question, is the drug doing what it's supposed to do? Is it, clearing beta amyloid plaque? And we got rid of, I know we talked earlier about clinically significant, but we took out that word because in this case, we don't really have a good way to determine at this point what is clinically significant. So it would make that PA much more difficult to adjudicate to leave that language in there. And then we ask or make sure there are no significant ARIA or other adverse events, and whether there was appropriate follow-up care. So those would be the next question. And I think, and then really for the last, we kind of finished it out. Number 7, we want to make sure if there were any adverse events that they were mild and the patient had appropriate follow-up. And number 8, we ask a question, make sure the patient has had at least 6 months of therapy. And in case the provider had to hold doses or there were treatment delays, this way the patient would be able to have 6 months of the drug and should be able to, get enough data at that point to know if it's heading in the right direction. So number 9, it's looking for documentation of clinical improvement based on those baseline assessments that we discussed earlier. So it's somewhat involved, but it follows a lot of the FDA trial information and the information that we have available for safety. So with our recommendations, we would ask that maintain aducanumab as a non-preferred agent in the Alzheimer's disease PDL class. Implement the PA criteria for aducanumab to ensure appropriate use, and then evaluate comparative cost in executive session. So
thank you, David. Any questions for Dave?
Couple of comments. First of all, the original study only included people who had amyloid deposits as documented by PET scans. Those with no amyloid deposits, theoretically the drug wouldn't work, and so they weren't tested. Now the FDA didn't include that in their prescribing information, but I think in concert with what the studies show, that if a patient does not have amyloid deposits as shown by a PET scan, they shouldn't have the drug. And there's a sizable percent of people, I don't know what it is, with Alzheimer's who do not have amyloid deposit and therefore shouldn't have the drug. The other thing is the studies were not completed. They're about 50% completed. Both were abandoned due to futility. And at that point, they were dead until the company did post hoc analysis, no new data, just post hoc analysis, and came up with some interesting information. Study 301 was a total bust. Study 302, they had 4 different measures scales. In 3 of the 4 scales, the change was below the MCID, the minimal clinical important difference. So the clinical amounts were insignificant. The 4th study is a new enough study. There isn't an MCID, so we don't know. So what little was known about it shows that it doesn't make a difference that is clinically significant. There's serious toxicity. The FDA didn't follow their own guidelines. The advisory panel voted unanimously not to approve, and the FDA approved it anyway. Several advisory members quit over this, and there has been quite a controversy over this on a national level. And we won't go into that, but I'd say the data on this one is really bad. And what the FDA has done with this in improving something in spite of the evidence is been blatant enough to get a lot of national attention. And there are some national organizations and teaching hospitals who've said, we will not cover this drug. I can tell you, I serve on the P&T committee for regions, and I can't tell you what our data was, but I can tell you the opinion was regions will not cover this drug. And
Bill, I didn't hear a question there, but we do have a speaker for the that may address your comments.
Yeah,
which,
I would welcome that.
Yeah, I thought you might. Any other comments or questions for Dave? Hearing none, Dr. Zabar, I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to unmute yourself. Can you do so?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay,
with that, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yuval Zabar. I'm a geriatric neurologist and a medical director with Biogen. Aduhelm is indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Treatment should be initiated in patients with MCI or mild dementia stage of disease, which is the population in which treatment was studied in the clinical trials. There are no safety or efficacy data for treatment at earlier or later disease stages. This indication is approved under accelerated approval based on reduction in amyloid beta plaque observed in treated patients. Continued approval for this indication may be contingent upon verification of clinical benefit in confirmatory trials. Titration is required for treatment initiation with a goal dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram given by IV infusion every 4 weeks. The proposed length of initial authorization for treatment by OHA is 6 months. Renewal criteria require documented evidence of clinically significant amyloid reduction compared to baseline confirmed by post-infusion brain imaging. Titration to the effective dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram takes a minimum of 6 months and can take longer if a patient experiences ARIA. In phase 3 trials, which included a 6-month titration, amyloid beta levels in the high dose group did not diverge from levels in the low dose group until patients had greater than 6 months of treatment. The CDR-SB in the high dose group in study 1 began to diverge from placebo after 12 months of treatment. Results from study 3, an earlier study which did not use titration except in one arm, showed that although amyloid beta reduction was detectable by 6 months, clinical effects were not seen until 1 year. Treated patients who had decreased SUVR scores of greater than 1 standard deviation demonstrated a stabilization of clinical decline for CDR-SB and MMSE scores after 1 year of treatment compared to placebo. Based on these findings, an initial authorization period of at least 12 months will be necessary to evaluate a clinical response to treatment. There are no contraindications. Warnings and precautions include hypersensitivity, angioedema and urticaria, and ARIA-E and H, which includes microhemorrhage and superficial siderosis. ARIA-E and H were observed in 41% of patients treated with a planned dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram compared to 10% of patients on placebo. The following AEs were at least 2% higher in placebo in both studies: ARIA-E, headache, ARIA-H, microhemorrhage and superficial siderosis, fall, diarrhea, and altered mental status. Enhanced clinical vigilance is recommended during the first 8 doses when the majority of ARIA was observed in both studies, although ARIA can occur anytime. To monitor for ARIA, brain MRIs within 1 year of treatment initiation and prior to the 7th and 12th infusions are recommended. The proposed OHA criteria include an MRI annually after the 12th infusion. The prescribing information does not have MRI monitoring recommendations beyond the 12th infusion. For additional details, I refer you to the prescribing information. Thank you for your time and consideration. and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Zabar. Any questions? All right, to remind the committee of the recommendations, we're going to maintain aducanumab as non-preferred. We propose implementing the PA criteria that was presented by Dr. Day, and we'll look at the comparative costs in executive session. Questions or a motion?
Yeah, this is Kat Livingston. So just a couple of thoughts. I mean, I would certainly echo everything that Bill was saying. It's very concerning that we have a therapy that has no proven clinical benefit and demonstrated harms. And so two comments, since this needs to be somewhere in terms of fee for service. So the first is that the studies look like they included a CDR SB of 0.5 and a mini mental status exam of 24 to 30, but the draft criteria are more generous than that. And I think given the fact that we have such little proof of any clinically significant benefit, I would recommend that we do a more conservative approach to that and at least limit it to the people who were included in the study and not expand beyond that. And then the other comment I had is when I see that people can have severe microhemorrhage and you can still continue it, it kind of breaks my clinician heart a little bit. Like I don't understand how a clinician could be like, oh, well, I see all the severe microhemorrhage that's been documented, but let's keep doing this therapy. I just really struggle with that, so.
Yeah, I would, this is Robin. I just want to add to that it's just sort of confusing to me as a public member to sort of look at this and wonder why we're even considering it. And I know there's been national headlines, but like, how did it get this far? It really, you know, there's just on its face, there's no there. So, anyway, definitely I support keeping it non-preferred and as conservative as we can. This does not feel like a good utilization of our healthcare resources.
One more
Appreciate
comment.
that. Yeah, Bill.
I think we should have pre-A criteria that are as strict as the data shows us to be. And I agree with what Kat has said, and I think we should add the PET scan to it. But this is so egregious. I've been at this a lot of years, and I don't agree with a lot of things the FDA does, but I can at least see the logic. This one goes beyond logic, evidence, and ethics. I cannot, in good conscience, recommend that any patient take this drug. This drug is dangerous, toxic, harmful, and is of no proven benefit. And although we cannot say that we cannot cover that because of law, I think we as a committee should recommend to the Oregon Health Authority that I would say that they find a way not to cover this because it is unsafe and ineffective, and it will harm our patients at a great cost. And you know, they can ignore that, but I would be very comfortable making that statement.
So Bill, appreciate your comments as always. What about the person in southeastern Oregon that can't get a PET scan?
Well, they will be saved the toxicity of the drug.
We pay for transportation. So we're going to pay for somebody from...
You know, there are two parts to this. There is the legal part of what we can legally do according to state law. And I think we need to be as strict as we can and put as many obstacles as we can legally on this because it's a bad drug.
Appreciate it.
Ethically, I think should go beyond that and make a statement that and politely stated that it is unsafe and unproven and should not be used. And then the Oregon Health Authority can do whatever they want with it. But I would ethically, I think that's our only choice because this is a very bad decision And I have no idea how on earth that happened. I know that the current FDA director is an interim appointee from the last administration. And so far, the present administration has refused to confirm her as the permanent head of the FDA. So the politics will play out, and we don't have to worry about that. But a drug that was abandoned as futile has been revived based on manipulation of the same evidence. And that is reprehensible. But other than that, you know.
Well, I encourage you to always share your opinion. Okay. So anybody else have any comments?
Oh, sorry, Bill, go ahead. I was gonna say, isn't
Bill,
the
you
PET
want to say something about the PET scan?
included in 7 already?
Yes,
It is. It's and. Go ahead, Dave.
No, I was just confirming. Yes, it's the last portion. It is included in there, and just to clarify as well.
Thank you. You're a step ahead of me. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And required.
And just one other comment, just to address Kat's comment a little bit earlier. In the renewal criteria, number 7, if it's mild, they're able to move on in the criteria. If it's not mild, then it does get denied. The note in there reflects language that's in the FDA labeling. So that's why it's in there. And if the physician, obviously this would most likely go through an additional process if the physician had extra information and wanted to continue on with this drug. They would have to provide extra information as to why they want to do that.
Along with our earlier, there's physician or provider, prescriber education initiatives that the PNT has initiated before. And I just wonder, we have a series of recent FDA approvals of drugs with no clinically significant benefit using surrogate outcomes. And I just wonder if there could be some accompaniment. So if there are prescribers who are doing this, sharing with them information about, here are the outcomes of the trials, here are the harms associated with it, and just making sure that they're getting objective, trusted, evidence-based summaries from OSU as you've already put them together, just so that they are aware of what the evidence actually shows.
A great suggestion.
Yeah, I love that idea, but yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I'll help whoever wants to write that.
So can we go ahead and change that to meet the clinical trial criteria? I'm hearing the FDA was a little bit more broad. Again, I'd like to see it narrow, given that we have no proof of benefit and we have proof of harm. And so I'm just really worried it's hurting my clinical soul. So can we do that? Can we make it above 24 for MMSE? And then
right, and then an MMSE score between 24 and 30. Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Correct. Okay. We can do that.
And then this, the other one, CDR SB box one.
Okay. We can do that.
So back to the before we go there, David, we have a recommendation to approve the PA criteria as proposed, as amended to change the MMSE and step in, please.
The CDRG or the CDR.
So you'd like to see a CDR score of
that's the proposal.
Yes. So was that a CDR score of were you saying just 0.5 and not 0.5 or 1?
Correct. That looks like that's what was in the studies.
Okay.
And then the final one was severe microhemorrhage makes me scared, and I would not want anyone to continue on this therapy who has severe microhemorrhage. So is it possible to make that not an option for continuation?
I can make a note of that. We would just need the committee to approve those changes. Correct, Roger?
That's correct. So we have a recommendation for the proposed PA criteria as amended.
Move to approve as amended.
This is Karen. I just want to clarify, does the amendment also include not allowing continued therapy if there's the microhemorrhage?
Dave?
I believe if I understood it right, we're basically striking that note on number 7 in the renewal criteria if radiologically severe ARIA is observed. Just if we strike that, then if there's anything more than a mild event, then it would be stopped for medical appropriateness.
Does that work, Karen?
I'm fine with that if Dr. Livingston feels that that is what she would like to have that step read.
My preference is that any severe harms would mean that no one would be treated with this anymore. I'm just, the idea of someone getting something that's not proven to be beneficial and then they get a harm, I think that should stop. And this is the one spot I saw severe in there, and so it seemed like a good place to cut. And I'm happy to have any other suggestions or thoughts on other things that should be edited.
I would suggest that if the patient has any evidence of microhemorrhage, the drug be discontinued or the drug not be removed. What do you think, Kat?
I'm sorry, Bill, I couldn't actually hear you.
I think Bill said that if a patient had any evidence of microhemorrhage, that they would not be eligible for continuation of therapy. So
that's correct.
PA criteria as proposed and amended. Dave, you capture all that?
I believe so, yes.
I think we have a motion from Bill, but we need a second.
Second, this is Karen.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you. Roger, you got all that?
Then I would like to make a further motion.
Go, Bill.
Is that appropriate at this time?
Sure.
I would like to move that we recommend that the Oregon Health Authority not cover this drug because it has significant toxicity and its benefit is unproven. Or any
What's
other
the committee
way,
say?
or any other way that somebody would like to say that.
No, I think you said it loud and clear. Anybody else in the committee have an opinion or a second?
Mine doesn't have to dominate here, even though it's always loud.
Are we allowed to do that as a committee? No,
Oh, you can make a recommendation.
I
all
thought
you
we didn't
want,
have a
Kathy.
choice, but we have to do something with it. I mean, I'm all for it, but if we, you know.
We can make
Kathy,
it, we can make it the motion we want, but they have no obligation to act upon it.
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct. Bill is correct.
Kathy, for your understanding, and Trevor, I can't believe I get to say this before you. the coverage of prescription drugs is an optional benefit. And yeah,
Okay.
we cover them. And with that comes the requirements of federal rebate law and what's a covered outpatient drug and what's FDA approved and what's compendia. And what Bill is saying is above and beyond that. We've acknowledged the fact that we are covering an outpatient drug that was approved by the FDA, but it doesn't have evidence that we are compelled by. And he's recommending the OHA consider thinking about not covering. Is that accurate, Bill?
Okay.
And to Kathy's point, this is a recommendation from the committee, and OHA can do what they want with that recommendation.
Correct.
What they have to do. Exactly.
All right. Do we have a second?
A second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? All right. Motion carries.
All right. We are certainly running behind schedule. Nonetheless, I would propose we go through one more topic. We have a couple of people that want to provide public comment for the topic of anti-parasitic agents.
Hey, Roger, you're cutting out. I can't hear you.
That might mean we need to stop, but let's forge on.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Refer the people to page 220 in the packet. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Fletcher. I think this is going to be the last topic of the day. We will be deferring Spravato and Evkeeza. Significant apologies to those manufacturer representatives that were signed up to provide public comment, but we're not going to review those today. This will be the last subject before we go to executive session. So with that, we'll turn it over to Sarah Fletcher.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Yeah, the last topic of the day, we're going to do topical antiparasitic agents for a class update. Next slide. The purpose of this is to evaluate any comparative evidence in the class since the last update, which was done in March of 2016. And then additionally, there's a new drug in this class. It's a topical metalloproteinase inhibitor that's approved to treat head lice in patients over 6 months with a single dose. Next slide. As far as our current policy, based on the Oregon prioritized list, lice and scabies are both funded conditions. Rosacea is not funded. You can see on the graph on the right, the current drugs in the class and the PDL status. And right now, nearly all of the class utilization is for preferred agents. And looking at internal data, we actually receive very few requests for any type of non-preferred therapy. So next slide, please. There is more extensive background in the packet, but just very generally, lice and scabies, permethrin and pyrethrins, I'll refer to them interchangeably, are generally considered first line, and then lindane, because of specific toxicities, is not really recommended for either. As far as head lice, permethrin does require a second treatment 7 to 10 days after the initial treatment for hatched nymphs. That's not treatment failure, that's just part of the normal treatment course. But there seems to be a reduced efficacy since studies that have been conducted over time since the drug was first introduced in the 1980s. There've been an identification of some knockdown resistance mutations, and this was in the background very briefly. Multiple gene mutations have been identified, and these are presumed to confer resistance. In certain ex vivo studies, there have been a reduced effectiveness as far as like time to killing of lice, but there's also some very low quality observational data that doesn't seem to show treatment failures in patients that do have lice that do have these mutations. I was unable to find any kind of high quality data that directly compared treatment failure and the presence of mutations in people. I could have missed it, but I did not find that. And then localized prevalence data, there's also not a lot of that available, but there is one published study that the author is here actually to speak on that, but it has localized KDR mutations based off sampling in 4 different sites in Oregon. 3 of the sites, the lice samples were obtained from 1 subject. One of the site, Portland, the lice samples were obtained from 5 different subjects. These lice all showed extensive frequency of the mutations. The sampling was performed by school nurses or professional lice combers who had volunteered for the study. And the method of recruitment for the specific lice infested subjects is unclear. So next slide. I did identify one high quality review. This was a Cochrane review that was comparative evidence and primarily done in developing countries. It included 15 different studies and almost 2,000 people. You can see the results from this. There's low certainty evidence of permethrin cream versus oral ivermectin. Permethrin did seem to have a higher clearance rate at 1 week, but little to no difference by week 2. If you compare permethrin cream to oral ivermectin, there's also moderate certainty evidence that there's little to no difference in clearance at 4 weeks, despite if they have 1 to 3 doses, and also little to no difference with complete cure after 1 week after a single treatment. And then thirdly, on this slide, there's moderate certainty evidence when you compare the 2 different topical treatments of little to no difference in complete clearance at 4 weeks. So next slide. This is the same Cochrane review. These are additional outcomes. There's moderate certainty evidence when you compare systemic versus topical ivermectin of little to no difference at 4 weeks. And then high certainty evidence that there's little to no difference in cure rate with 1 dose versus 2 doses. The reporting of adverse events was suboptimal, and that there were no withdrawals or anything like that from these studies. So next slide. I did find 4 different guidelines, 2 on lice and 2 on scabies, and those were all excluded for poor quality based on methodology or failure to report conflict of interest. And I just wanted to note that the American Academy of Pediatrics clinical report, it was presented in the March of 2016 committee meeting, and that's why it was only included in the background of this. Also by the Agree To tool, which is our current tool to assess quality for clinical practice guidelines, there are significant methodologic deficiencies in this clinical report. So next slide. As far as new indications, spinosad did receive an expanded indication for treatment in scabies in adults and pediatrics over 4 years. It was previously only approved in lice. And then ivermectin has received a prescription to over-the-counter status approval for its indication in head lice. Its use in scabies is off-label, I believe. No new safety alerts were identified. Next slide. For the new drug review, abemedipir is a metalloproteinase inhibitor, which disrupts certain enzymes necessary for egg hatching and louse development. It's significantly ovicidal, and it currently is approved for topical treatment in head lice in patients 6 months of age and older. Next slide. The approval of this drug was based off of 2 identical studies. It was double-blind, vehicle-controlled, and randomized. You can see that the number of subjects, there were about 108 index subjects in each group and 200 to 270 non-index subjects. An index subject is the youngest patient in a household who is infested with lice. Non-index subjects are all of the other household members who are also infested. And so they're randomized by household, so everyone gets the same thing, and then it was stratified by site. And you can see the duration was 14 days. It was a single application. The primary outcome was louse-free at 14 days. You can see the effectiveness was around 80%, and you can also see the placebo response at around 50%. That led to a number needed to treat of 3 to 4 for these 2 different trials. Next slide, please. So limitations of this trial, there was no active comparison in a class that already has quite a few different agents that are known to be effective. It was unclear how blinding was maintained or if the vehicle control had any kind of smell or color differences. That just wasn't specifically noted. And there was an unexpectedly high placebo response rate of around 50%. The training of the evaluators and the method of detection wasn't clearly described. In the background in the packet, I discussed visual observation versus dry combing versus wet combing. In a comparison, wet combing had a sensitivity of over 90% compared to 29% for visual observation. So depending on how it was done, that could explain the placebo response rate that was quite high as well. These studies did exclude those with underlying skin conditions, and it was primarily white women, and there was a moderate Hispanic representation. Very few Black participants, but they're much less likely to get lice because of differences in their hair shaft. Next slide, please. As far as clinical safety, there was only 1 severe adverse reaction. It was judged not to be due to the medication, no withdrawals. This product does contain benzyl alcohol, and so it's not approved for those under 6 months old, and those patients were excluded. Additionally, you can see in this chart the other adverse reactions typical of a topical agent: erythema, rash, skin burning. None of them were very severe. And then next slide. So the recommendations on the table are to maintain abimodipine as non-preferred on the Oregon Health Plan. There's also an ivermectin topical cream that's only indicated for rosacea that just didn't end up in the class when it came across FDB. So we'd like to move it there and designate it as non-preferred. And then current evidence doesn't support additional changes to the PDL at this time, but we'd like to take it to executive session to evaluate costs. So are there any questions I can answer before we go to public comment? I know we have a couple of commenters.
All right, no questions for Sarah. Great job. We do have two people that wish to provide public comment today. Dr. John Clark will treat you first. You're a co-host, so are you able to unmute yourself?
I believe so. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. My name is John Clark, and I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in environmental toxicology and chemistry, and worked on louse resistance for about the last 20 years. On my first slide, I'm going to be talking about permethrin resistance mechanisms and monitoring and how it pertains to the selection of effective and new pediculicides. A summary of my research in Oregon has proven that knockdown.
Just for clarification, we don't have your slides up. I've shared those with the committee. We don't have the capacity we're showing those. So if you want to reference the information and just so you understand, expound upon that information for the committee's consideration. It has been shared with the committee for their consideration, but no slides are shown at this
time. I understand that, yes. All right. So a summary of my research in Oregon has proven that knockdown resistance due to KDR mutation is widespread at high levels. Permethrin is a pyrethroid insecticide. It's the active ingredient in a over-the-counter formulation called Mix, which has been the first line therapy for the treatment of pediculosis since it was introduced on the market in about 1984. We came into this area about 2000 with an NIH-funded grant to study why Nix was no longer as effective as it was when it first came on the market. We identified some permethrin-resistant lice, which had a knockdown phenotype, where the KDR is due to point mutations within the alpha subunit gene of the voltage-sensitive sodium channel, which is the target site of permethrin, leading to target site insensitivity and resistance. KDR also shows cross-resistance to DDT and the natural pyrethrins, which are active ingredients in other compounds like RID, other formulations like RID. We identified 3 point mutations that were KDR mutations and caused target site insensitivity in head lice, and we used those point mutations to develop a population genotyping method called quantitative sequencing, which allowed us to detect the resistant allele frequency in head louse populations. We basically have run 4 separate KDR mapping exercises. The one in 2016, which is in my packet of slides, was the last one, and we found that 48 of the 48 states that we sampled had KDR mutations. 132 of the 138 sites, we had saturation of the KDR mutations in the lice that were there, and the overall mean resistant allele frequency by quantitative sequencing was 98.3. In Oregon, again, this has been talked about, we sampled 4 sites. 3 of the sites were 100%, had 100% KDR resistant mutations, and the Wilsonville site was about 81%. We compared our data, if you're looking at my slides, this is slide 8, and what our data shows is that there's a good correlation between the decreasing efficacy of the Nix formulation in 12 clinical studies compared to the increased frequency of KDR mutations within louse populations that we collected in the United States over 2000, about 2016. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Dr. Clark. Yeah, go, Bill.
How many patients were in the Oregon studies?
Couldn't hear you.
Sorry, how many patients were in the Oregon studies?
The Oregon study was not a whole bunch of people. I think there were, 5 or 6 people that we took that were collected from. We collected over 5 lice from over close to 500 individual subjects in the 48 states that we collected from, and we collected about 14,000 lice.
Okay, but the Oregon study was pretty small.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Dr. Clark? We also have David Bevich from Parapro Manufacturer. Can you hear me?
Yes, Roger, thank you. I formally requested an audience with the Oregon P&T committee, and I wanted to thank Roger and Sarah for allowing me to discuss the gap in evidence-based clinical research regarding the head lice resistance to the current Oregon PDL with head lice treatments. The resistance evidence renders current PDL medications completely ineffective in the state of Oregon. As Dr. Clark just shared with you, his research was funded by the National Institute of Health and was published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, so it lacks bias. Dr. Clark's research is in alignment with Oregon's 2021 updated P&T review standards. The committee will act and based on what, and I quote, sound evidence-based research and processes widely accepted by the medical profession. Based upon these 2 principles, I request that Oregon P&T committee act to add Natroba spinosad topical suspension 0.9% as a preferred agent to the Oregon PDL. Since the last Oregon review of the pediculicide category in 2016, Natroba has become the #1 prescribed head lice medication in the United States, and therefore this request is based on Dr. Clark's testimony specific to Oregon's head lice population, which has proved 3 different Oregon cities with various populations to have 100% resistance in permethrin and pyrethrin head lice populations, which is clinically significant. Natroba's research goal was not to compromise the safety profile of the over-the-counter medications, but to provide the efficacy that is now absent. Based on this goal, Natroba has now become the #1 prescribed head lice medication and recognized by the American Academy of Pediatrics as the option when resistance is proven. And I quote from the AAP, in areas where known resistance to the over-the-counter pediculicide, parents should involve their pediatricians for a treatment with a prescription medication such as spinosad or topical ivermectin. Natroba's topical suspension does meet the criteria outlined by the AAP. Natroba is the only head lice medication with no known resistance to the active compound spinosad, which is derived by a naturally occurring soil bacterium in the category. Amangiozin et al. Research paper, Human Lice in Current State of Knowledge, published in Frontiers in Cellular and Infectious Microbiology, observed that Natroba is the only head lice medication currently available in the United States market proven to be both ovicidal and pediculicidal. Based on Dr. Clark's NIH-funded guidelines, as well as the sound evidence presented based process widely accepted by the medical profession, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, I respectfully ask Oregon's committee to move to add Natroba to a preferred position. By adding Natroba to a preferred position, this would put Oregon in line with the additional SSDC states in their buying consortium, as Natroba is preferred in all of those other states. Thank you. Now I'm open for questions.
Any questions for David?
I'd like to thank you for the time.
You bet. So the recommendations are in front of you as a committee. Maintain abemaciclib as non-preferred on the OHP PDL. Move ivermectin Solantra. It's a cream. Designated as non-preferred. We're going to review an executive session. Questions? For a motion.
Motion to approve recommendations.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you.
All right, this time we're going to be moving to executive session. It takes a little bit of logistics for us to move you all there. I'm looking for my notes that I have to read. And so with that, the P&T committee will now meet in executive session for the purpose of consideration of information or records that are exempt for disclosure by law. The executive session is held pursuant to RS 192-660-2F and ORS 414-356-1 and 2, which allows the P&T committee to meet in executive session and discuss reviewing confidential drug pricing information, including substantial drug cost differences between drugs within the same therapeutic class. It's necessary for the committee to make final recommendations to comply with the requirements for House Bill 2100 from 2009. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to not participate. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report. No decision may be made in executive session, and at the end of executive session, we'll return to open session, welcome the audience back into the discussion. Thank you. We're back in open session. I don't know if anybody can hear me. I had some difficulties.
Yes.
I can hear you fine.
Rock star.
You sound good too.
Oh, I love it. Can you tell my wife? Okay. All right. With that, I was not privy to all the conversations that are going on in exec. I'm going to defer to my team to
Wrap it up.
Yeah, wrap up what the recommendations are for the decision. Or they can defer to me and change what my recommendations are.
Everything's the same as what we had on the recommendation summary, Roger?
All right, with that, I am going to, can you hear me well, like, still?
I love how you sound, Roger. Love
All
how
right.
you sound.
This is going to be a one and done recommendation unless we make changes. In regards to the inhaled anticholinergics, the recommendation is to make Combivent Respimat and in Cruise Ellipta preferred. In regards to the non-injectable anti-epileptics, Litscan, the recommendation is no PDL changes. As far as the biologics for autoimmune disorders, renamed to the targeted immune modulators, we're going to make secukinumab Cosentyx preferred. For the CGRP inhibitor class update, make erinibimab Aimovig preferred. Make galcanezumab Emgality non-preferred. For the Hep C direct-acting antivirals, make the branded Epclusa non-preferred. For the PAH, for the PAH class update, no PDL changes are recommended. And for the Alzheimer's drug class update, make donepezil preferred, rivastigmine capsules preferred, memantidine ER sprinkle caps preferred, and the memantidine donepezil combos preferred, and to maintain aducanumab non-preferred. I believe the rest, thank you. And in regards to topical antiparasitics, make Vanalice gel non-preferred. The rest of the classes were deferred for future topics questions, or motion?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Abstain? All right. I
Thank
think
you
we
all.
are finished.
We are. Great job, everybody. We have a couple topics we'll defer to the next meeting. The next meeting is slated for December 2nd. Appreciate your patience. I was having lots of issues, but yeah, appreciate your donation of your time. We'll talk to you soon.
Have a good evening.
Bye. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.